What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What If I Were Reborn in Teen Wolf as Scott McCall? The True Alpha, Part 2. If you enjoy this type of content, please smash the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. Let's dive into the rise of a true alpha without further ado. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as Deaton arrived, his face calm but clearly intrigued by Scott's message. Deaton greeted Scott and Styles with a nod, but before they could dive into the strange situation, Derek reappeared, looking as if he'd missed out on something important. Scott looked at Derek with a mocking grin. "So that's how you handle hunters, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "The second you hear them coming, you just tuck your tail between your legs and run?" He raised an eyebrow, relishing the opportunity to mess with Derek. Derek's jaw tightened, but he brushed it off with a dismissive grunt. "I'm not stupid enough to hang around when they show up armed." Scott laughed. "So whenever you see them, you just bolt? Sounds like a real alpha in the making to me." He threw Derek a teasing grin, nudging Styles, who stifled a laugh. Derek glared at Styles, who quickly darted behind Scott for protection. "That's just how it works," Derek muttered defensively. "Yeah, exactly what a coward would say," Scott shot back, his tone light but his gaze challenging. "Running from hunters just makes them more aggressive. They start thinking they're the apex. If they come after me, I'll remind them who's actually the hunter and who's the prey. We're predators, Derek. Don't ever forget that." Derek's eyes narrowed, his voice low. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Scott rolled his eyes, shrugging. "Whatever makes you happy, man." With Derek silenced, Scott turned to Deaton, who had knelt beside the massive boar's corpse. "So, Doc, any clue what this thing is? Where did it come from?" Just as Deaton began to answer, Derek cut in, eyeing Deaton suspiciously. "Who are you, and why are you here?" Scott stepped between the two, protecting Deaton. "Relax, Derek. I called him here. He's a friend, a vet I work with, and no, he's not the alpha, so stop looking at him like that." Derek snorted, unconvinced. "How do you know he's not the alpha?" Scott shrugged. "For starters, he was your mother's emissary." Derek's eyes widened. "What?" Deaton's voice was calm. "Yes, but that was a long time ago. It's not something I discuss anymore." With that, Deaton turned his focus back to the boar, carefully examining its massive tusks and the strange red glint in its lifeless eyes. After a few moments, he straightened, looking perplexed. "I don't know what this creature is. I've never seen or even heard of anything like it in Beacon Hills." Styles, always curious, stepped closer. "But do you know anything that might be similar, Doc? Even a legend or myth?" Deaton nodded. "There is one story that comes to mind. Have any of you read about the Erymanthian boar?" Scott, Derek, and Styles exchanged confused glances, shaking their heads. Deaton's tone turned contemplative. In Greek mythology, the Erymanthian boar was a massive, fearsome creature. It was described as a wild, untamable beast with jagged tusks and a hunger for destruction. Hercules himself was sent to capture it as one of his 12 labors. The way it's described, black, huge, with eyes that burned like fire, sounds very much like this. Styles glanced back at the massive boar, eyes widening. "So, this thing is what, Hercules' boar? Some ancient creature brought to life?" Deaton shook his head. "No, not exactly. This one is clearly not as large as the Erymanthian boar from the legends, and it doesn't seem supernatural in the same way, but it's undeniably close in appearance." "Does that mean there could be more of them out there?" Styles asked, his voice full of a nervous energy that only seemed to grow the more he thought about it. "That I don't know. But Scott." Deaton's gaze turned serious. "Remember what I told you about the Nemeton?" Scott nodded. "Yeah. You said it's like a beacon, drawing supernatural creatures toward it." "Yes. But that's only part of it." Deaton's gaze drifted to the massive boar. In ancient druidic tales, it's said that when a Nemeton has a strong surge of energy, It can sometimes do more than attract creatures. It can transform the ones already around it. Its power seeps into the environment, and animals that were once ordinary gain supernatural traits. Styles' face drained of color. So not only can this tree bring every monster and ghost to Beacon Hills, but it might also turn innocent little animals into this? He gestured wildly at the boar. Scott chuckled, a hint of excitement flashing in his eyes. Sounds like things are about to get a whole lot more interesting. Styles threw him an exasperated look. Interesting? You think this is interesting? Not only do we have a psychotic alpha tearing up the town, but now I have to worry about a pack of giant mutant squirrels, or I don't know, a zombie raccoon going for my throat? I swear, if some demonic bug shows up in my room one night, I'm moving to Canada. Scott burst out laughing. Oh, come on, Styles. Where's your sense of adventure? Adventure? This is a nightmare waiting to happen. Styles shot back, half serious but smiling. Easy for you to say, Mister, I've got werewolf powers to save my butt. Scott laughed harder, clapping Styles on the shoulder. You'll be fine. Just stay close to me. The tension melted away as they laughed, standing around the bizarre scene of the giant boar. For now, the danger had passed, but something told Scott this was just the beginning. Deaton looked at Scott with a slight smile. Well, if anyone's up for the challenge, I suppose it's you too. Just be careful, Scott. There are things out there beyond our knowledge. The world is full of mysteries, and not all of them are easy to tame. The next morning started with a burst of mischief. Scott, as usual, was up to his antics, and today's fun involved Allison's dad, Chris Argent. After breakfast with his mom, Scott drove to pick up Allison from her house, catching Chris's eye as he kissed her on the cheek and gave him a smug grin. Morning, Uncle Chris. Scott greeted him with a cheeky grin. Chris's eyes narrowed dangerously, but Allison quickly pulled Scott away by his ear and dragged him toward his car. Do you have to annoy him every time? She chided, but a hint of a smile betrayed her amusement. Hey, he's family now, Scott teased, rubbing his ear but looking far too pleased with himself. They headed off to school, laughter filling the car as Allison couldn't help but find his playful confidence contagious. At school, Scott and Allison noticed an unusual amount of commotion in the parking lot. Several sheriff's deputies were scattered around, talking with a few students who looked a little shaken up. As they stepped out of the car, they heard whispers from nearby students. Did you hear? The bus driver was found dead, mauled by some animal, someone said. Scott exchanged a quick look with Allison, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew exactly what had happened. Garrison Myers, the bus driver, was just the latest of Peter Hale's victims. He felt no sympathy for the man. Myers had been involved in the Hale house fire. He'd been in on it with Kate Argent. Scott had decided long ago that, as long as Peter didn't harm the innocent, he wouldn't interfere with his revenge. Not yet, anyway. Styles came running up, nearly tripping over himself in his hurry to deliver the news. Scott. Did you hear about? His eyes fell on Allison, and he stopped abruptly, suddenly remembering that she was in the dark about Beacon Hill's supernatural happenings. Did you hear about the incident? He stammered, making wide, nervous gestures that did little to hide his discomfort. Scott patted Styles on the shoulder, offering a small smile. It's okay, Styles, you can breathe. We heard, he said, sparing his friend further embarrassment. Later, during lunch in the cafeteria, Scott, Allison, and Styles sat together, joined, rather unexpectedly, by Lydia and Jackson. Scott wasn't thrilled about it, especially with Jackson shooting him occasional glares, but he brushed it off. Jackson's bad mood was hardly his problem. So, anyone hear anything new about the bus driver? Allison asked. Lydia's eyes lit up with a mix of frustration and boredom. Can we talk about something a bit more fun, please? She asked, tossing her hair over her shoulder. Like, where are we going tomorrow night? Scott exchanged glances with Allison, both caught off guard. What exactly are you talking about, Lydia? Allison asked, looking genuinely confused. Lydia sighed as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You said you and Scott were hanging out tomorrow night, right? She said, leaning in. So, let's make it a double date. We'll all go out together. Scott, however, wasn't having it. Sorry, Lydia, but I'm taking Allison on a date, just the two of us. No offense, but the last thing I need is Jackson tagging along, he replied, flashing Jackson a teasing smile that he knew would provoke him. Jackson's expression tightened, and Lydia rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, Scott. Jackson's not that bad." Scott raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Sure, as long as he keeps his mouth shut and doesn't get on my nerves. Because if he does, we might have to test his pain tolerance," Scott quipped, keeping his voice light but unmistakably firm. Lydia glared at him, her fiery spirit on full display. "You're being a jerk, McCall," she snapped. "Allison deserves someone better." Scott, unfazed, simply chuckled. "Well, not to brag, but I am the most handsome guy in Beacon Hills," he said with a playful wink at Allison. "And Allison's lucky to have me." Allison rolled her eyes, clearly amused by his antics. "Oh, so I'm just an ugly lucky girl, huh?" she teased, nudging him. Scott gave her a dramatic look of mock horror. "Wait, no. Who said that?" he said quickly, trying to cover his slip. He turned to Styles. "Oh, it was you, Styles, you said that, didn't you? Just because you are single? You want me and Allison to break up? I thought we were brothers, man." Styles, who had been munching on his fries while watching the whole exchange, immediately played along. "Whoa, Scott, throwing me under the bus." "Some brother you are," he said, feigning betrayal. Allison laughed, enjoying the banter as she folded her arms, giving Scott a mock glare. "Maybe you deserve a little punishment for that one." Scott held up his hands, backing up slightly. "Hey now, let's not get hasty here. You know I was just kidding." Allison raised an eyebrow and then glanced at Styles, who immediately caught on. "You know what? I think he does deserve a little lesson," he said mischievously. With that, Allison reached out and tugged Scott by the ear, much to Styles's delight. Okay, I surrender." Scott laughed, doing his best to look repentant. "Allison, I'm sorry. You're the most beautiful girl in the world. How could I even think I was doing you a favor?" She rolled her eyes, releasing his ear. "Just don't forget it," she replied with a grin. "Or you might not be so lucky next time." As Scott rubbed his ear, he glared playfully at Styles. "You're enjoying this way too much, man." Styles shrugged, ducking behind Allison for protection. "Hey, I'm just here for moral support." Scott huffed, then turned his attention to Jackson, who had been watching everything with an expression of disdain. "And what's with the look, jackass? Maybe I should teach you a lesson." Jackson glared back, but before he could say anything, Allison tugged Scott's arm, pulling him toward the door. "All right, Mr. Troublemaker, it's time for our next class." Scott smirked at Jackson, letting Allison lead him away. "Saved by the bell," he whispered just loud enough for Jackson to hear, enjoying the frustrated look on his face. The evening was cool, and Beacon Hills was tinged with a golden glow as the sun dipped below the horizon. Scott, dressed simply but with an effortless charm, pulled up outside Allison's house to pick her up for their date. She stepped out of her front door, a radiant smile lighting up her face, and Scott's heart skipped a beat. Tonight, he'd promised to make this night memorable, with no interruptions, just him and Allison. They drove to a quiet, secluded spot Scott had found overlooking the twinkling lights of Beacon Hills. A cozy blanket was spread out on the grass, with a picnic of all Allison's favorite snacks, each chosen with care. She noticed the little touches and smiled warmly, touched by his thoughtfulness. As they shared stories and laughter, Scott felt a rare calm settle over him, savoring every moment, Allison's laughter blending with the gentle rustle of leaves in the night breeze. Halfway through, Scott reached for her hand, looking deep into her eyes with a sincerity that made Allison's heart flutter. "Allison, I just want you to know how much you mean to me," he murmured, his voice low and warm. "Being here with you, it makes everything else just disappear." Allison's face softened, a soft pink blush warming her cheeks as she squeezed his hand. "Scott, I feel the same," she whispered. In the quiet of the moment, they shared a deep, lingering kiss, a kiss that felt like it held every unsaid word between them. As they pulled back, Allison blushed and shyly hid her face in Scott's chest, laughing softly. Scott wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his heart pounding with happiness. For the rest of the night, they talked about dreams, their future, and even silly what-ifs, imagining the lives they'd lead. When Scott finally drove Allison back to her house, he couldn't shake the happiness and deep sense of peace he felt. It was a night that would linger in both their hearts, a memory they'd treasure forever. When they arrived, Scott opened the car door for her, walking her up the steps to her door. But as he was about to say goodnight, the door opened, and there stood Victoria Argent, her face warm but clearly scrutinizing. "Oh, Scott, thank you for bringing Allison home," Victoria said with a polite smile. "Why don't you come in for a bit? We were just about to sit down for dinner." Scott sensed the challenge, but he met it head-on with a friendly smile. "Sure, Mrs. Argent," he replied confidently, walking in without hesitation. To Victoria's surprise, Scott didn't linger by the door but went straight to the kitchen, where he saw her preparing the final touches for dinner. "Can I help you with anything?" he asked, already grabbing some plates to set the table. Victoria looked slightly taken aback but nodded, appreciating his initiative. "Well, thank you, Scott. It's rare to see such manners." Scott winked playfully. "My mom taught me well." As they worked, Victoria's expression softened slightly, surprised by his natural charisma. They'd just set the table when a voice from behind made Scott's stomach tighten. Well, look who we have here. Allison's new boyfriend. And a cute one too," Kate Argent's voice drawled, her gaze lingering on him with an intensity that made Allison visibly uncomfortable. "Maybe I should compete with Allison for you." Scott didn't miss a beat, giving her a polite but firm nod. "Nice to meet you, Auntie Kate," he said, his voice laced with mock respect, "but I'm not really into older women." Allison stifled a giggle, and Kate's amused expression faltered momentarily. She managed a forced smile. "That's rude, Scott." Scott shrugged, nonchalant. "Maybe, but is flirting with your niece's boyfriend in front of her not a bit rude too?" Allison broke into laughter, and even Victoria smirked a little. Kate, however, was clearly unamused and, after an eye roll, sat down at the table. Scott took his seat next to Allison, who looked at him with a mix of admiration and amusement, clearly enjoying the exchange. Dinner began pleasantly, with Victoria serving her homemade dishes. Scott took his first bite and looked up at her, genuine appreciation shining in his eyes. "Mrs. Argent, this is incredible." Victoria raised an eyebrow, a hint of pride showing. "Thank you, Scott. It's nice to have someone notice." Chris Argent, however, wasn't as charmed. His gaze was cool as he watched Scott, and after a few moments, he cleared his throat, glancing at Scott with a measured look. "Scott, would you like a drink?" Chris asked, gesturing to the bottle of whiskey he was pouring for himself. Scott politely shook his head. "I don't drink alcohol, Uncle Chris. Just water is fine." Victoria took the opportunity to turn the conversation towards Scott's work. "Allison was just telling us that you work for a veterinarian," she said, clearly probing. Allison jumped in, her tone soft as she grabbed Scott's hand. "He was actually there to take care of the dog I hit. He's been amazing." Scott nodded. "Yeah, I help out with a lot of animals there." Chris's eyes narrowed as he took a slow sip of his drink. "And what does your boss think about all the animal attacks around Beacon Hills?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Any theories?" Scott shrugged, giving him a casual smile. "Everyone's saying it's a mountain lion," he said, voice steady. Then with a sly grin he added, "But we both know it's not a mountain lion, don't we, Uncle Chris?" The room fell silent. Allison looked puzzled, but Chris, Victoria, and Kate shot Scott sharp, cold stares. Scott could see the hint of alarm in their eyes, suspecting he was about to reveal more than he should. Chris's eyes flashed dangerously. "Don't you dare," he said in a low warning voice. Scott met Chris's gaze, not backing down for a moment. "Allison deserves to know, Uncle Chris. I wouldn't want her going out for a morning run in the woods and stumbling upon something dangerous." His words were layered, their meaning clear, and Allison turned to him, eyebrows furrowing. "What are you talking about, Scott?" she asked, a note of concern in her voice. Scott sighed, giving her a look of sincerity. "A few days ago, I was in the woods with Stiles, and we saw your dad and a few of his friends," he began. "They were armed, rifles, bows. I guess they were hunting deer or something, and while I was talking to Uncle Chris, something came out of the bushes." "What was it?" Allison's voice was tense, her hand gripping his tightly. "A boar," Scott replied, watching the way her face twisted with confusion. "But not just any boar, a massive one. 2 meters tall with tusks like swords. Your dad and his men couldn't even kill it, and 2 of them died." And 2 were badly injured before me, and Styles ran for our lives." Allison gasped, horror dawning on her face. "Are you serious?" Scott nodded, his expression somber. "Ask your dad. He was there. When I went back for Uncle Chris, he and his friends were gone. And the boar was dead. Something had smashed its skull, a skull that had taken bullets like nothing. Whatever killed it wasn't human." Chris's face went pale. "What? That thing is dead," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Allison turned to Chris, her eyes blazing. "Is that true? You were there, and you didn't tell me? And Scott, why didn't you tell me either?" Scott shrugged, looking mildly apologetic. "Your dad would have killed me if I told you anything. But don't worry, Allison, I'm not going to keep things from you again. Not when it's this dangerous." Allison softened, though her gaze was still sharp with lingering frustration. "Fine. You're forgiven. This time." Chris started to say something, but Allison cut him off. "I don't want to hear it, Dad. You almost died, and you didn't even think to tell me." Scott nodded. "That's why I told her, Uncle Chris. I didn't want her going into the woods alone. Not while things like that boar and whatever killed it are out there." Just then, Scott's phone buzzed. He glanced down, reading a text from Styles. "Derek's been shot. He's looking for you." Scott read the message and shot back a quick reply, "Take him to the animal clinic." Allison's curiosity sparked again as she watched him. Who was that? Scott slipped his phone back into his pocket. "Styles. He found an injured dog and needs my help." He turned to the family with a polite smile. "Thank you all for dinner, but I think I should get going." Allison walked him to the door, her expression a mixture of amusement and concern. "Are you sure it's just a dog?" Scott chuckled, squeezing her hand with a reassuring smile. "Yes, it's just a dog," he replied, his tone light but sincere. Then, leaning in, he gave her a gentle kiss on the lips, lingering just a moment as if to promise he'd always come back to her. As he pulled away, he winked. "I'll see you tomorrow, Allison." With that, he stepped out into the night, feeling her gaze on him as he headed off, ready for whatever Beacon Hills would throw his way next. As Scott slipped out of the Argent household, the tension between Allison and Chris was far from settled. Inside, Chris was about to explain himself to Allison. But as he approached her door, Allison's loud shout, "Not now, Dad," left no room for discussion. She stormed into her room, and the door closed with a finality that resonated with both Chris and Victoria. "Give her some time and let her calm down," Victoria murmured, pulling Chris back into the living room. Kate, watching with an amused glint in her eye, threw herself casually onto the sofa. "Looks like your little girl is growing up, Chris," she teased. Ignoring Kate's taunting tone, Chris took a deep breath, his jaw clenched as he glanced at her and then at Victoria, who stood with arms crossed. "So how strong was that boar, really?" Kate asked, a trace of curiosity mixing with her typical thrill-seeking glint. Chris looked at her with a steady, grim expression. "It was a monster, Kate. The rifles and weapons we brought barely fazed it. The thing was nearly unstoppable." Victoria's gaze flicked between them, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Then what do you think could have killed it? Something that size and strength. It would take something even more powerful." Chris's face darkened, and he hesitated before answering. "If what Scott said is true, then we're talking about a creature with enough power to crush a skull that resisted bullets. Something very powerful." Kate's eyes gleamed as she spoke up. "It has to be the Alpha, the one that ambushed me yesterday. That thing could have easily torn apart a beast like that boar." Chris's expression grew serious. "If that's the case, then we're dealing with an Alpha unlike anything we've seen before. It's stronger, and probably smarter. We'll need to be even more prepared next time." Meanwhile, at the animal clinic, Scott arrived and let Styles and Derek in. Then he made a quick call to Deaton, asking him to come and assist with Derek's injury. As he waited, Scott observed Derek lying on the table, sweat beading his forehead as he battled the effects of the Nordic blue monkshood poisoning. Deaton arrived quickly, bringing supplies from the back of the clinic. He scanned Derek's condition with a look of deep concern, muttering as he examined the wound. "Nordic blue monkshood," he said finally, raising an eyebrow. "Rare and deadly. Can you fix him?" Scott asked, glancing between Deaton and the pale, trembling Derek. "Luckily, I've kept some here for emergencies like this," Deaton replied, pulling out a jar of the same wolfsbane from a dusty shelf in the clinic's basement. Carefully, he burned the leaves, letting the ash collect before applying it directly to Derek's wound. The room filled with Derek's screams as the ash burned into his flesh, drawing out the toxins. Within moments, the infection began to dissipate, and the wound closed up as Derek's skin knitted itself back together. Scott patting Derek on the shoulder. "Are you good now?" Derek sat up, still wincing from the lingering pain. Minus the agonizing pain? Fantastic. He tried to sound tough, but the relief in his voice betrayed him. Styles, always one to break the tension, smirked. "Hey, you know what they say, if you can still be sarcastic, you're halfway to healed. Trust me, I'm an expert." Scott, however, was far from finished. He turned to Derek. "We just saved your life," he said. "So now you owe me one." Scott doesn't like Derek that much. He knows Derek isn't that bad, but he recalled how Derek treated Scott in the first and second seasons of Teen Wolf. In the first season, he used Scott as bait, and in the second season, after becoming an alpha, Derek started turning teenagers into werewolves, and he even created the Kanima. Plus he beat Scott badly to make him submit and become part of his pack, so Scott has to make Derek understand that he is not to be used or underestimated. And more importantly, keep him away from Allison. Derek glanced at Scott, clearly taken aback by the sudden change in his demeanor. Scott took a step closer, his eyes glowing an intense red as he released his alpha aura, letting the power and authority seep into the air between them. Before Derek could react, Scott's hand shot forward, gripping him by the neck as he pulled him face to face. "I know you have a grudge against Kate Argent," Scott said, his voice low, dangerous. "But hear me out, if you ever go near Allison, if you even think about involving her in this, you'll find out firsthand that there are things much worse than death." The intensity of Scott's words, combined with the overwhelming aura he was giving off, left Derek speechless. He could feel the primal power radiating from Scott, the kind of power that made his wolf instincts shrink back in submission. After a tense pause, Derek finally nodded. Scott released him, stepping back as his eyes faded to their usual dark brown. Derek regained his composure and asked, "How come you're an alpha?" Scott shrugged as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It is what it is." Deaton, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. "Scott is what we call a true alpha, Derek," he explained, a faint smile of pride flickering on his face. "He skipped being a beta entirely. I've never heard of anything like it. He's a born leader, a rarity among werewolves." Derek's eyes widened at the revelation, but Scott simply brushed it off, his relaxed smile returning. "Anyway, as fun as this chit-chat is, I need to head home. If I don't, my mom will definitely beat my ass for staying out this late." He turned to Deaton and Styles, giving them a casual wave. "Good night, guys. And Derek." He shot a pointed look in his direction. "Remember what we talked about." Derek gave a reluctant nod, still feeling the weight of Scott's warning as he watched him leave. Styles smiled mischievously as he leaned in and gave Derek a back pat. "Well, Derek, look at the bright side. We didn't have to saw your arm off." Deaton chuckled lightly. As they left the clinic, Derek still processing the strange turn of events. The shadows had lengthened over Beacon Hills as the Argent family's presence grew more visible and vigilant. Especially after the recent attack. The town buzzed with quiet murmurs and tension, as if it too sensed the looming threat that lurked just beyond the trees. Allison was sitting in her room, scrolling through her phone, when she heard a faint noise outside her window. Startled, she walked toward it, staring out into the shadowy backyard. She was used to deer and raccoons wandering through, but tonight was different. She felt the weight of an unseen gaze, something predatory and menacing. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she caught a glint, two glowing red orbs staring back at her. For a moment, Allison was frozen, a mix of curiosity and unease washing over her. But then, the shape of the creature started to solidify. It wasn't just her imagination. She could make out the bulky silhouette of a large beast, its body low to the ground, muscles coiled and ready to pounce. Fear gripped her. It was huge, much bigger than any animal she'd seen around Beacon Hills. It was then that her father, Chris Argent, burst onto the scene. Allison barely had time to register his presence before he raised his gun and fired a shot straight at the beast. The creature let out a guttural snarl, its red eyes narrowing before it disappeared into the forest. Allison turned to her father, her heart racing. "Dad," she managed to say, her voice trembling. What was that?" Chris put a firm hand on her shoulder. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart," he said. "Just remember, don't go wandering off into the woods. Stay safe." The worry etched into his face told her that it was no ordinary animal. And while she trusted her father, Allison couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. They were too intelligent, too knowing. She tried to convince herself it was just a bear or a wolf, but a part of her knew better. Allison walked up to Scott between classes, her face pale and a little on edge. She glanced around to make sure they were alone before leaning in close, her voice barely a whisper. "Scott," she began, her voice a mix of fear and confusion, "something happened last night." Scott's casual smile vanished as he picked up on her worry. "What happened?" I think I saw a bear." She hesitated, eyes darting nervously. But it wasn't like any bear I've ever seen. It had these glowing red eyes. It was outside my window, and it felt like it was watching me. Scott's stomach twisted. He knew those glowing eyes and their owner. Only one person would have the audacity to get close to Allison. "Are you sure it was a bear?" Allison frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I mean, it was huge, and I was scared. My dad shot at it, but it just walked away." Scott clenched his jaw, a fire igniting in his chest. Allison hadn't realized what kind of danger had lurked outside her window, but Scott did. If Peter wanted to scare her, Scott would make sure it was Peter who left terrified. "Thanks for telling me, Allison. And don't worry, you're safe." The rest of the school day dragged by, the usual sounds of lockers slamming and students talking feeling muted to Scott. He kept his thoughts to himself, didn't let on what he was planning, even as Stiles joked and prodded him during lunch. Allison stayed close, occasionally glancing over at him, her brows still knitted with concern. Scott kept his expression neutral, unwilling to let Stiles or Allison catch on to what he was planning. He knew he had to confront Peter alone. This wasn't something Stiles could help him with, and he didn't want Allison anywhere near the fight he knew was coming. When the last bell rang, Scott walked out of school, his resolve set. He made his way straight to the hospital where Peter was being kept, his eyes dark and determined. The sterile fluorescent lights of the hospital barely softened the grim air that surrounded the isolated wing. Peter lay in his bed, looking bored and tapping his fingers on the tray attached to his bed when Scott pushed open the door. For a moment, Peter froze, his eyes widening in surprise. But it was quickly replaced with a smirk as he looked at Scott standing in the doorway. "Peter," said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. He feigned weakness, clutching his blanket. "What are you doing here, kid? Lost, maybe?" Scott walked slowly to the chair by Peter's bed, his face unreadable, calm, and sat down without a word. Peter's smile faltered as Scott stared at him with a level gaze. "You did something you shouldn't have done yesterday, Peter," Scott said, his tone unervingly calm. Peter's eyes narrowed, the sly amusement replaced by guarded curiosity. He tilted his head, pretending innocence. "How do you know my name, kid?" "The name of a poor patient recovering in the hospital." Scott's calm expression didn't change. "I know more than that, Mr. Alpha." For a brief second, Peter's facade cracked, but he quickly covered it up with a laugh. "Kid, I think you're mistaken. I have no idea what you're talking about. Now, if you don't leave, I might just call the nurse." Scott smirked, a confidence radiating from him that unnerved Peter. "Don't play dumb, Peter. I know what you are. So let's cut to the chase." Peter's face dropped, his eyes narrowing with calculating malice. But Scott didn't blink. His tone remained steady, his gaze unwavering. "Let's meet tonight in the woods. You and me. I'll be waiting, don't be late." He didn't wait for a response. Scott stood, gave Peter one last cold look, and walked out of the room, leaving Peter to process the audacity of the boy who dared to challenge him. The smirk that Peter wore on his face began to slip, replaced by something resembling unease. He was beginning to understand that Scott wasn't the beta he thought he could control. Nightfall came quickly, casting a deep shadow over the Beacon Hills Preserve. Scott waited in the woods, standing tall, every nerve focused and calm. Scott was an alpha, strong, determined, and more than ready to face Peter, knowing his own power was far beyond what Peter could comprehend. As he stood there, Scott felt the primal force within him pulse, ready to confront the one who threatened Allison. Whatever Peter Hale had planned, Scott was prepared to make him regret it. This was his territory now, and anyone who posed a threat to his pack would soon learn that Scott McCall wasn't to be underestimated. The moon cast a silver glow over the clearing in the woods as Scott waited, calm and unwavering. It wasn't long before the leaves rustled, and Peter Hale appeared, his smirk oozing with dark confidence. Scott crossed his arms, meeting Peter's gaze without an ounce of fear. Peter raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Scott, I have to admit, I'm impressed. But tell me, how did you know who I am? And what I am?" Scott shrugged nonchalantly. "Beat me first, and maybe I'll tell you." Peter's smirk turned to a grin, his eyes gleaming a menacing red as he stepped closer. His fingers elongated, turning into razor-sharp claws, and his face took on an ominous snarl as he leaned in, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't forget, Scott, you're just my beta." With that, Peter roared, a thunderous sound designed to force Scott into submission. But Scott didn't flinch. Instead, he met Peter's roar with a calm, almost amused smile. Then, without a word, Scott's eyes ignited, a bright red that left Peter momentarily speechless. Before Peter could react, Scott clenched his fist and drove it hard into Peter's gut, sending him stumbling back, gasping for air. The punch reverberated through the clearing, and Peter, stunned, staggered to his feet. He looked at Scott, shock plastered across his face. How are you, an alpha?" Scott kept his gaze steady. "Apparently, I'm what they call a true alpha," he said with a casual smirk. "Oh, and by the way, thanks for the bite." Peter's face paled as the truth set in. "A true alpha," he murmured, his mind racing. "The rarest type of alpha. How can it be you?" Scott chuckled. "Guess I'm just that talented." He cracked his knuckles, stepping forward. "Enough talking, Peter. Let's fight." Peter's eyes narrowed, anger replacing his initial shock. He leaned back and let out a growl, his bones shifting and lengthening as he transformed into his full werewolf form. Towering over Scott, his dark fur bristled under the moonlight, and his eyes gleamed with an intense bloodlust. He lowered his voice to a deep, guttural tone. "I'll show you what a real alpha is, kid." With that, Peter charged, teeth bared and claws outstretched. Scott stood his ground, not even bothering to shift. Instead, he sidestepped Peter's swipe, effortlessly dodging each attack, and landed a swift kick to Peter's side, sending him tumbling into a nearby tree. Peter scrambled up, fury flashing across his face as he lunged again. But Scott barely broke a sweat. Even in his human form, he could feel his strength far surpassing Peter's, and the realization filled him with confidence. He danced around Peter's attacks, landing precise hits with a playful ease. Each punch, each kick, sent Peter reeling back, his growls turning into frustrated snarls. Scott grinned, taunting him. "Is that all you've got, Peter?" Frustration turned to desperation as Peter lunged wildly, hoping to land even a single blow. But Scott continued to dodge, his calm smirk never faltering. He was toying with Peter now, using him as nothing more than a practice dummy. After a few more jabs, Scott drew back, watching Peter struggle to stand, his breath ragged and his body battered. Scott's voice dropped to a low, amused tone. "I'm getting bored, Peter." With that, he delivered a powerful uppercut, sending Peter flying backward. Peter landed on the ground, whimpering like a wounded animal, his once mighty presence reduced to a trembling mess. Scott straightened, pulling off his shirt, and looked down at Peter with a smile that sent chills through Peter's core. "I think it's time I show you what a real alpha looks like." With a deep breath, Scott's body began to shift, his bones lengthening, his muscles expanding. Black fur rippled across his skin, and his eyes glowed an intense red, casting an eerie glow across the clearing. When he finished transforming, he towered over Peter, a formidable figure with power radiating from every inch. Peter looked up, terror evident in his face as he took in the sight of Scott's full werewolf form, a tall, imposing figure with a strength that far exceeded anything Peter had ever encountered. He stumbled back, unable to hide the fear in his eyes. Scott bared his fangs, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Still think you're the alpha here?" Without waiting for an answer, Scott attacked, moving with a speed and force that left Peter helpless. He struck Peter's arm, snapping it like a twig. Peter roared, his voice filled with agony as Scott delivered blow after brutal blow, each strike sending shockwaves through the clearing. Peter's legs buckled, his own bones betraying him, and he fell to the ground, coughing up blood, his body broken and defeated. Scott crouched down beside him, looking into Peter's bloodshot eyes with cold detachment. "You're free to go after Kate Argent. I won't stop you. Frankly, I don't like her. And I don't like you either. You killed your niece for power." Peter's face contorted in confusion and pain as he tried to focus on Scott's words. Scott's expression turned icy as he continued. "But if you go after Allison, you'll be dealing with me. And next time, I won't stop until there's nothing left of you. Nod if you understand." With fear overtaking him, Peter gave a trembling nod, his body too weak to fight back. Scott raised a hand, then slapped him, the blow sharp and final. Peter winced, humiliation mingling with his pain. And with that final blow to his pride, Peter turned back to his human form and surrendered to unconsciousness. Scott took a step back, returning to his human form. He picked up his clothes and slipped them back on, casting one last look at the broken, bloodied figure of Peter lying on the ground. Allison, he thought, feeling the intensity of his purpose. He knew what he had to do next. The time had come to tell Allison the truth, not only about her family's legacy but about the supernatural world she was unknowingly already part of. She deserved to know, and Scott would make sure she did, no matter what. Scott's heart raced as he drove to pick up Allison. Today was the day. No more secrets, no more hiding. He was finally ready to tell her the truth, and something inside him told him that she was ready too. His mind buzzed with anticipation, replaying how he'd tell her, what he'd show her, and how she might react. When her phone buzzed, Allison felt a mixture of excitement and nerves twist in her stomach. It was Scott, telling her he needed to see her and that it was important. Something about his message made her heart race. As he arrived, she hurried out to meet him, unable to shake the feeling that today was going to change everything. They drove in comfortable silence, and as they approached the secluded area Scott had chosen, Allison's curiosity only grew. "So where are we going?" she asked with a smile. Scott chuckled, and gave her a mischievous look. "Well, let's just say that I want to show you something, and it will blow your mind, Allison." Scott led Allison to a quiet clearing, the morning sunlight filtering through the trees. He stopped and turned to face her, his expression serious yet kind. "Allison, do you trust me?" Allison looked up at him, feeling her heartbeat quicken. "Of course, Scott. What's going on? You're making me nervous." Scott took a deep breath, considering how best to ease her into the truth. "There's something you need to know, something no one has told you." Allison's eyes widened with interest. "What?" He exhaled, searching her gaze for any hint of fear. "The supernatural. It's real, Allison." She blinked, processing his words before breaking into laughter. "Are you serious? Supernatural, like vampires and werewolves?" Scott remained silent, letting his intense gaze convey what words couldn't. Allison's laughter faded, her expression turning skeptical but intrigued. "You're not joking, are you?" She searched his face for any hint of a prank. "You're saying creatures like werewolves are real?" Scott nodded. "Yes, Allison. I'm completely serious. The bear you thought you saw the other night wasn't a bear. It was a werewolf." Allison took a step back, her pulse quickening. "Scott, if this is some kind of joke." He reached out, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's not a joke. This is the reality we live in." His voice was calm, grounding her disbelief. She hesitated, biting her lip, feeling torn between doubt and the trust she had in him. "Scott, I love you, but this is hard to believe." Scott's eyes softened, and he leaned in, meeting her gaze. "What did you just say?" Allison froze, replaying her words, then flushed. I didn't say anything." Scott chuckled, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Oh, you definitely said something." She crossed her arms, cheeks tinged with embarrassment. "You didn't hear anything. Got it." He took her hands in his gaze tender. "For the record, I love you too." Before she could respond, Scott leaned in and pressed a gentle lingering kiss to her lips, pulling her closer as if to reassure her. When he pulled away, her heart raced even faster, any doubts about him vanishing. Allison, he said, regaining her attention, I know it sounds crazy, but that's why I brought you here, to show you, not just tell you. Scott stepped back, letting go of her hands. I'm a werewolf, he said. Allison watched as his eyes shifted from brown to an intense, glowing red, his hands sprouting claws in front of her. She gasped, instinctively taking a step back before fascination overtook her fear. She moved closer, peering at his transformed features in awe. This is amazing, she whispered, gently reaching out to touch his hand, tracing the edges of his claws. Wait, you don't lose control under the full moon, like in the stories and movies, do you? Scott shook his head, smiling. Not exactly. I'm special. I don't lose control at all. As for other werewolves, only newly turned werewolves have trouble. They need guidance. As she looked up at him, a thought struck her. Wait. The night I saw something outside my window, that wasn't you, was it? Scott's face grew serious. No, that wasn't me. But you don't have to worry. He won't be coming around again. I made sure of that yesterday. Allison's eyes widened. Who was it, and why was he there? Scott hesitated, then said, I'll explain more later. Right now, I want to show you something else. He took a step back, a smirk playing at his lips as he began unbuttoning his shirt. Allison's eyes widened in surprise, covering her face but still peeking between her fingers. What are you doing, you perv? Scott didn't hesitate, flashing her a teasing grin as he stripped down, completely unbothered by her reaction. I need to shift fully, and clothes don't exactly survive that. She turned away, fighting a smile but sneaking peeks, her cheeks bright red. He raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying her flustered reaction. Like what you see, he teased, nodding downwards. Allison groaned, covering her face fully now. I am not looking at you anymore, you shameless pervert. Scott laughed, the sound deep and genuine. All right. But turn around, this is something you need to see. Slowly, Allison turned, and her breath caught as she watched him shift. His muscles rippled as his body transformed, his frame growing until he stood in his full werewolf form, a towering black-furred creature with red glowing eyes. The sheer power radiating from him left her speechless. Despite her initial fear, she found herself fascinated, inching closer until she could reach out and touch him. This is incredible, she whispered, her fingers gently brushing his fur. She circled around him, and started playing with his fluffy tail. Eventually, her gaze drifted downward, looking at his crotch, her curiosity getting the better of her. Wait, where did your, little wolf go? Scott, catching her gaze, chuckled deeply. I don't have one in this form. Can you imagine if my precious little wolf was dangling and my enemy hit me there? Oh, I'm feeling the pain just by thinking about it. So let's just say werewolves don't need to have everything hanging out unprotected in a fight. Allison burst out laughing, the tension breaking as she clutched her sides. I can't believe I just asked that. You're ridiculous. Grinning, Scott said. Ready for more? She raised an eyebrow, still catching her breath from laughing. There's more. He smirked. Oh yeah. Now for the ultimate reveal. Scott transformed once more, but this time into a large black wolf, his eyes still glowing red. He was magnificent, larger than any wolf she'd ever seen, his powerful form towering over her even in this shape. His movements were graceful as he walked over to her, nudging her gently with his head. Unable to resist, Allison ran her hands through his fur, marveling at the silky texture. Sit, she said, laughing as he obediently complied, wagging his tail like an oversized, enthusiastic dog. She scratched behind his ears, cooing at him playfully. Scott let out a huff, giving her an unimpressed look, but couldn't hide the amusement in his eyes. This is insane, she whispered, leaning in close to his massive head. Amazing. Scott stayed in his wolf form a little longer, allowing Allison to fully embrace the reality of his existence. After a while, Scott shifted back to his human form, pulling Allison close. This is my world, Allison. It's dangerous, complicated, and probably more than you bargained for. Allison looked up at him, her expression serious. It might be more than I expected, Scott. But I'm here. I trust you. Her voice softened. And I love you. Scott's eyes gleamed with happiness, pulling her into his arms once again. I love you too. As Scott wrapped his arms around Allison, he felt her warmth sink into him, grounding him in this strange new life he'd created in Beacon Hills. She leaned back, her eyes sparkled with curiosity. So, she said, almost playfully, now that I know what you are, can you tell me more about werewolves? Scott grinned, nodding as he settled into his thoughts, remembering everything he knew and everything he'd learned from being here in Beacon Hills a second time around. Alright, so here's the basics. There's a whole structure to werewolf packs. You've got omegas, who are basically lone wolves. They don't have a pack or an alpha. Then there are betas. Betas are usually the ones who follow an alpha, gaining strength by being in a pack. And then there's the alpha, Allison said, her eyes lighting up as she pieced things together. The leader. Exactly. The alpha is the strongest of them all, at least in a regular pack, Scott said. The stronger the pack, the stronger their alpha will be. Packs share power. It's kind of like they feed off each other's strength. But alphas, they stand out because they're leaders. And one way to tell them apart is by their eyes. Allison raised an eyebrow, intrigued. By their eyes. Scott nodded. Yeah, all werewolves start with golden eyes, whether they're born or bitten. But if a werewolf, if they take an innocent life, their eyes turn blue. It shows that they've crossed a line and done something they regret. And when a werewolf becomes an alpha, their eyes turn red. Allison's fingers brushed his as she looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. So you are an alpha, that's why the color of your eyes is red? Scott paused, a small smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, but it's more than just that. I'm what they call a true alpha. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly in interest. A true alpha? Is that different from other alphas? Very different, Scott explained. Most alphas get their power one of two ways. They either inherit it, or they kill an alpha to take their place. But a true alpha is rare. They become an alpha through sheer strength of will. No inheritance, no killing, just pure power and character. Allison's gaze held a mix of awe and respect as she took that in. So, you're one of those. A true alpha. Scott grinned, clearly a little proud. Yep. Lucky me, I guess. They shared a quiet laugh, and Scott could feel the tension of keeping his secrets fading, little by little. Allison looked thoughtful for a moment, then asked, are there any other kinds of alphas out there? Scott's face grew more serious as he remembered one name that had haunted Beacon Hills in another life. Well, there's another one, but I'm not sure if he counts as a different kind of alphas. She leaned closer, her eyes bright with curiosity. What type is that? Scott looked at her, hesitating just a moment. There's something called a demon wolf. He's an alpha leading a pack that's made up of only alphas. He is currently one of the most powerful werewolves alive. Allison's expression turned cautious. Wait, do you know who this demon wolf is? Yeah, Scott replied, nodding. His name is Deucalion. He used to live in Beacon Hills, actually, but I don't know where he is now. Allison looked at him carefully. You think he's stronger than you? Scott shrugged, confidence sparking in his eyes. I don't really know, but I'm very strong too. And if he comes around, I'll handle it. She gave him a playful smile. I don't doubt it for a second. They laughed, letting the conversation take on a lighter tone. Allison tilted her head, studying him with newfound curiosity. So, can all werewolves shift like you can? I mean, can they turn into a giant wolf or a big furry werewolf like you did? Scott shook his head. No, not usually. Most werewolves just get the fangs, the claws, the glowing eyes, and maybe a bit of fur. Full wolf forms are rare, even among alphas. As for the full werewolf form, where you look like, well, a beast, I only know of 2 werewolves besides me who can do that. One's the guy outside your window the other night. The other. He trailed off, considering his words carefully. The other one, I'll tell you about him after I tell you about the other supernatural creatures I saw so far. Allison's eyes sparkled. Okay, so you're even more unique than I thought. Scott shrugged, looking modest but clearly pleased. Guess so. He squeezed her hand back, their fingers entwined. The moment felt real, and Scott knew he'd do anything to keep her safe. Allison suddenly looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Wait, How long have you been a werewolf? Scott brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his voice soft. About a month, give or take. Her eyes widened in surprise. A month? So, that means we met just after you were bitten. Scott nodded, a slight grin on his face. Yep. Remember that rainy night? You and your mom almost hit someone with your car. Allison's mouth opened slightly in shock as she remembered. That was you? I thought it was some drunk guy causing trouble on the road. Scott laughed, gently pinching her cheek. Yep, that was me. Not my best moment, I'll admit. She giggled, playfully swatting his hand away. Well, look at you now. They settled back against a fallen log, and Scott started to recount some of his experiences over the past few weeks. It hasn't all been werewolves, either. There are other creatures out there. I've already come across a few. Allison looked at him, intrigued. Like what? There was a ghoul, nasty thing. And a giant boar the size of a horse. I killed them both. Scott said, his voice calm. She blinked, clearly stunned. Wait, you're saying you killed those things? Because you told us at dinner that something else killed that boar-like creature. Scott gave her an amused look, rolling his eyes slightly. Yeah, well, I wasn't going to announce to your dad that I'm a werewolf. Even if he didn't shoot me, he'd probably make us break up on the spot. Allison snickered. Probably. But something tells me you know something about my dad and my family that I don't. Scott hesitated, the question hanging in the air between them. This was the moment he dreaded, the part of the truth that could change everything between them. He looked into her eyes, his own gaze steady but thoughtful. She was stronger than he'd realized. Maybe she was ready to know even more. Well, Allison, he began slowly, carefully choosing his words. That's actually what I was going to tell you next. Allison gave him a small, encouraging smile, nodding as if silently telling him to go on. He exhaled, a sense of calm settling over him. This was the start of something deeper, a bond not just of love, but of trust, and Scott felt ready to share everything with her. Scott leaned back against a fallen log, his arm wrapped around Allison. She looked at him, eyes wide with anticipation. Remember when I told you I only know 2 werewolves other than me who can transform into a full werewolf form? Scott started, his tone both serious and excited. Allison nodded. Yeah, the one that came near my house, and the other, the one you promised you'd tell me about later. Scott grinned, savoring the suspense for just a moment longer. The other one is called La Bête du Gavaudan, or just La Bête. Allison's eyes narrowed in thought. It means the beast of Gavaudan. She paused, glancing at him with curiosity. But what does that have to do with my family, Scott? Oh, he had everything to do with your family, babe. He grinned, teasingly dragging out the moment. Allison arched an eyebrow. All right, McCall, out with it. Spill the beans. Scott chuckled, settling in for the story. All right, sit tight because this is quite the tale. Clearing his throat, Scott began the story with dramatic flair. It all starts in France, back in the early 1700s. France, early 1700. Sebastien Vallet was a French soldier, fearless and determined, who had spent his life in battles. In the height of the 7 Years' War, he and his loyal friend Marcel were fighting side by side, allied with the Native Americans to resist the British forces. But one rainy night, while fleeing the British, Sebastien tripped and fell. His face landed directly in a muddy puddle, and in that moment, he unknowingly drank from it. But it wasn't just any puddle, Scott explained, leaning closer to Allison as he painted the picture. It was water collected in the paw print of a wolf. Allison shivered, captivated. What happened to him? Sebastien was transformed, Scott continued, voice dropping to a hush. Not just into any werewolf. He became La Bête, a monstrous creature made of shadows, a beast who loved tearing anything in his path apart. He leaned back, eyes twinkling as he gauged her reaction. And Marcel helped him keep it a secret. They went around terrorizing the countryside, and soon enough, everyone was talking about La Bête. Allison was hooked. She leaned in closer, eyes wide. Then what? When Sebastien returned to his home village in Gavaudan, the murders got worse. The people were terrified, and the first casualty in the village was a boy named Emile. That's when they organized a hunting party, led by Sebastien's sister, Marie-Jeanne Vallet. Scott paused for effect, watching as Allison's face shifted from intrigue to realization. She was his sister? Scott nodded. Yup. Known for her hunting skills, Marie-Jean was determined to put an end to the terror plaguing her village, no matter the cost. And she didn't work alone. There was a man named Henri Argent, a wise villager with knowledge about herbs and supernatural defenses. Rumor has it, he might have been a druid. He knew about mistletoe, mountain ash, all the stuff that can hurt creatures like La Bête. The air felt charged with anticipation, and Scott could see Allison's eyes flicker with admiration for Marie-Jean and Henri. With Henry's help, Marie-Jean tracked Sebastian across the wild landscapes of Auvergne and South Dordogne. She chased him for months, through forests, villages, and mountains. But one night, she discovered the awful truth: the beast was her own brother. Allison's face twisted in a mixture of horror and awe. So, did she hunt her own brother? Scott nodded, voice dropping. Yeah. She didn't hesitate. Her sense of duty was stronger than the heartbreak. Armed with Henry's knowledge, she went after him, determined to end the suffering he was causing. And she did it. She killed him and became a legend for it. Allison sat in stunned silence for a moment, the gravity of the story settling over her. So, she killed her own brother to save the people. That's incredible and tragic. Scott reached over, taking her hand. Marie-Jean wasn't just any hunter, Allison. She was your ancestor. The first true Argent. Allison's jaw dropped. Wait. Marie-Jean Vallée. She's really my ancestor. Scott chuckled. According to the story, yeah. And that beast? That was your Menegrit's uncle, Sebastian. Allison wrinkled her nose, her expression somewhere between disbelief and disgust. That thing is not related to me. Scott laughed, his warm grin softening her look of disgust. So, I take it you're disowning him? Allison burst into laughter, shaking her head. Absolutely. Then narrowing her eyes, she asked, Wait, how do you know all this? Scott's thoughts flashed to the truth, that he knew because he'd watched it all unfold on screen, because he was from another world entirely. He won't tell her that, though. He's not going to share that with anyone. Therefore, he came up with the idea of creating a wise, mysterious person and give him his other name, Jacob. So, with a mischievous glint in his eyes, he put on a mysterious tone. I helped an old man named Jacob a couple of weeks ago, he said casually. Whatever he wasn't a normal human. He knew what I was, and even that I was a true alpha. He said to me, Young pup, since you seem to be new to the whole wolf thing, allow me, an elderly man, to let you know what you're getting yourself into as a thank you for your help. So, he told me a lot about the supernatural, and when we got to the hunters, he told me about your family because you are the ones that live in Beacon Hills. That is why I know about your family's history. Allison looked intrigued. So, where is this old man Jacob now? Scott shrugged. He left Beacon Hills, said he liked wandering around the world. Do you actually believe what he said about my family? She asked, looking at him with wide eyes. Scott nodded. Absolutely. Besides, I already knew your father, mother, and aunt are hunters, and they don't mess around. They're not afraid to do whatever it takes to take down anything they see as a threat. Allison took a deep breath, her face turning serious as she absorbed this. So my dad, my family, they'd come after you? Scott gave her hand a gentle squeeze. If they knew about me, and if they thought I was dangerous, yeah. That's why I've kept everything hidden, and why I hesitated to tell you. But you should be more worried about them, not me. Allison shot him a playful glare, grabbing his ear and giving it a gentle twist. What would you do to them, Mr. Big Bad Wolf? Scott yelped, laughing as he pretended to pull away. Okay. Don't worry, babe, I'm just going to beat your fave. No, I mean, tell your father that if he gets between us, I'm going to kidnap you and run away, take you somewhere he'd never find us. As for your mom. Allison gave him a challenging look. What about my mom? Scott thought for a second, then grinned. I'd cook for her, win her over with my culinary skills. I bet I could charm her eventually. Allison laughed, giving his ear one last tug before letting go. You're dreaming. She's as stubborn as they come. They both laughed, the tension easing as they settled back together. Allison looked away for a moment, a thoughtful frown settling on her face. Why didn't he ever tell me any of this? Scott reached over, rubbing her back gently. He's probably trying to protect you, hoping you'll have a normal life for as long as possible. But you have the right to know, and I didn't want to keep it from you. Especially since... He trailed off, his voice softening. Especially since you mean everything to me. Allison's expression softened, her gaze searching his face. She cupped his face in her hands, her eyes shining with emotion. Scott, I'm glad you told me. I don't want you hiding things from me. If this is who you are, then I want to be part of it. Scott leaned his forehead against hers, taking a deep breath. You have no idea how much it means to me hearing you say that. But, Allison, this is dangerous. People get hurt. And if your family finds out about us... Allison smiled, her thumb brushing against his cheek. Then we'll face it together. Scott's heart swelled, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. They both knew the world they were entering was treacherous and uncertain, but in that moment, with Allison by his side, Scott felt like he could face anything. A few days ago, POV Styles leaned back against the worn leather seat of his dad's cruiser, juggling a burger and a large soda in one hand, while trying to keep his precious curly fries out of his dad's reach with the other. Outside, the world was quiet, bathed in the glow of streetlights as Beacon Hill settled into the night. Dad, seriously. These fries are off limits, Styles protested, swatting away his father's hand. I'm only looking out for you, you know. Health is important. Sheriff Stilinski chuckled, a twinkle of mischief in his eyes as he reached for the fries again. Kid, I carry a lethal weapon for a living. That gives me every right to eat whatever I want. He flashed Styles a grin before grabbing a couple of fries, much to Styles' dismay. You're abusing your power, you know that? Styles grumbled. Just as his dad opened his mouth to respond, the radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the comfortable silence. All units, possible 187, at video 2*C. Immediate assistance requested. Sheriff Stilinski's face hardened, fries forgotten. That's a homicide, he muttered, quickly shifting the car into drive as he turned on the lights and siren. Styles, heart racing, stuffed the burger in his mouth and buckled up. He knew what was coming next. Within minutes, they arrived at the video rental store. The red and blue lights from the other patrol cars painted the scene in an eerie light. A small crowd had gathered outside, whispering and pointing at the broken front window. Yellow police tape was already being strung up, and Styles spotted Jackson and Lydia near the entrance, looking visibly shaken. Styles hopped out of the car, trying to get a better look at the scene, but his dad held him back with a firm hand on his shoulder. Stay put, Styles. This is police business. Styles watched as his dad approached Jackson and Lydia, who were speaking to an officer. Jackson looked irritated, as usual, while Lydia seemed distant, her eyes fixated on something far away. Sheriff Stilinski moved in closer, trying to calm Jackson. Are you all right? The sheriff asked, glancing at Jackson's head. Jackson, still reeling, muttered, I'm fine. Just want to go home. Sheriff Stilinski looked doubtful. A shelf of DVDs fell on you, son. You need to let the EMTs check you out first. Head injuries aren't something to take lightly. I'm fine. You're just a minimum wage rent-a-cop. You don't know anything. The insult hung in the air, and Styles felt his blood boil, hands clenching into fists at his sides. He wanted to march over and give Jackson a piece of his mind, but his dad kept his cool, nodding to the officer to let them leave. Jackson stormed off, Lydia trailing behind him. As the ambulance and officers started to clear out, Styles couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. His dad had been investigating strange animal attacks for weeks now, and he couldn't tell him that a psychotic alpha was the cause of all of those incidents. The following morning, Styles was woken up by a loud knock on his door. His dad stepped in, a tired but hopeful expression on his face. So, am I going to hear good news at your parent-teacher conference tonight? Styles blinked, still half asleep, before groaning. Good news? Depends. What's your definition of good? Straight A's and no notes about behavior, his dad replied, raising a skeptical eyebrow. Then yeah, probably not, Styles muttered, scratching the back of his head sheepishly. His dad just sighed, giving him a pat on the shoulder before heading downstairs. Styles watched him go, a small smile on his face. As much as they bickered, he knew his dad only wanted what was best for him. Later that day, Sheriff Stalinsky stopped by the animal clinic to see if Deaton had made any progress with the animal that had killed Laura Hale and mauled Garrison Myers and Levesque. Sheriff Stalinsky's face was tense as he approached Deaton, and his questioning was straightforward but pressing. Deaton shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff, I'm really not an expert in wild animal behavior," he insisted. Sheriff Stalinsky frowned. "Last time we talked, you were pretty sure it was a mountain lion, Deaton. And now, after that attack at the video store, we need answers." He handed over some surveillance footage, his expression unreadable as Deaton reviewed it. Deaton studied the video closely, and for a brief moment, recognition flickered across his face. He cleared his throat, trying to mask his reaction. "I've never seen an animal like this, especially one that can move from all fours to walking on two legs." Sheriff Stalinsky's eyes narrowed. He sensed Deaton was holding something back, but before he could press further, Deaton nodded toward the back room, saying, "Well, I've got a sick dog I need to treat. Good luck with your case, Sheriff." Sheriff paused, studying Deaton's uneasy demeanor, then gave a short nod. "Thanks for your time, document," he replied, heading out. As he left, a nagging feeling told him there was more to Deaton's story, but for now, he'd have to let it go. By evening, Styles found himself reluctantly at the school for the parent-teacher conference, trying to hold his tongue as his dad met with Coach Finstock. The coach, forever in his chaotic mode, had his usual struggle with Styles' name. "Styles Stalinsky," Coach muttered, squinting at his clipboard. "Wait, that's your name? I thought that was your last name." "It's a nickname, Coach," Sheriff Stalinsky said, his tone strained as he glanced at his son. "His real name is after his grandfather." Coach just shrugged. "Well, the kid's got spirit. Smart, too, when he's actually focused. But let's just say he's a tad distracted. Do you know he wrote an entire history of male circumcision on his economics exam?" "Wait, what?" Sheriff Stalinsky's face turned beet red. He looked at Styles, horror and disbelief warring in his expression. "On an economics exam, Styles? Really?" Styles just grinned, shrugging. It was relevant, in a roundabout way. His dad covered his face with his hand. As they left the conference, Styles tried to play it cool, but he could see his dad's concerned look out of the corner of his eye. As they were heading out, a low growl echoed through the parking lot, making Styles' heart skip a beat. Sheriff Stalinsky's instincts kicked in, and he pulled out his gun. Styles' pulse quickened as he watched his dad and Chris Argent move toward the sound, bracing himself for whatever might come out of the shadows. But it was only a mountain lion. "Dad, we should back up," Styles whispered. Sheriff Stalinsky held up a hand, signaling him to stay still as he aimed his gun, but in the rush of movement, another car backed out of its spot, catching his dad off guard and bumping him off balance. Sheriff Stalinsky fell to the ground, and Styles rushed to his side, relief flooding him as the mountain lion ran off into the dark. Later, Styles met up with Scott, still stewing over his dad's close call. Scott noticed his expression and asked, "How's your dad doing after, that car thing?" Styles crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes at Scott. "He's fine. Not that you seemed too worried about it when you were running off to save Allison." Scott held up his hands defensively. "Styles, come on. It was just a mountain lion, and your dad has a gun. If it was something dangerous, I would help, even if it meant shifting in front of everyone. I wouldn't let anything happen to your dad." Styles' frustration softened, and he let out a sigh. "I know, Scott. I'm sorry. I was scared, I just don't want to lose him too, He knew his best friend would have helped if it had been the Alpha or some other supernatural creature. Scott sighed, reaching out to pat Styles on the back. "I know, man. And don't worry too much, your dad will be fine." That evening, Styles lay in his room, staring at the ceiling. He felt restless, caught between too many worlds: the kid his dad wanted him to be, the friend he was supposed to be, and the person who knew way too much about the shadows lurking in Beacon Hills. Peter Hale's POV. The stillness of a hospital room seemed to throb around Peter Hale, and he forced his breaths to match the shallow, empty rhythm of his feigned coma. Just beyond the cracked door, Melissa McCall passed by with her usual brisk steps, the clipboard in hand, focus intense. Peter's eyes lingered on her, a smirk creeping onto his face as an idea formed. If he used her, he could force Scott to submit, bend the young wolf to his will. Yet, memories of Scott's raw power and the merciless beating he'd taken just days before resurfaced. He felt a knot tightening in his stomach, a mix of fear and longing for a strength like Scott's. Each recollection was a stark reminder of his own vulnerability, leaving him questioning whether he could ever truly stand up to such ferocity. Peter dismissed the idea of using Melissa, and thought that if he provoked Scott again, he would definitely kill him this time. Peter smiled wickedly and thought, who cares about that stupid kid? Anyway, I have bigger plans tonight. I'm going to hunt the real beasts, Reddick and Unger, two of the many who burned my family and set my world aflame. With a single movement, Peter slipped out of his hospital bed, casting away the weak shell of a comatose patient. His form shifted, muscles rippling and darkening, his bones cracking as the alpha rose from the shell. And soon he left the hospital. The woods held a breathless quiet, only the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a branch disturbing the thick silence. Reddick and Unger stumbled through the underbrush, their laughter loud and careless, shoving each other roughly as they shared a stolen bottle of liquor. Peter stalked them, his senses sharp, lurking just beyond the edge of their awareness. As Unger took a swig and muttered something about leaving, Peter melted back into the shadows, watching, waiting. The smell of fear began to creep through the air as Unger's nerves frayed, his gaze flickering around as if sensing an unseen predator. "Stop being a sissy, Unger." Reddick sneered, stopping for a smoke break. But as he struck a match, Peter moved. He lunged forward, an invisible force in the night, his claws flashing in the dim light as he seized Reddick's head and yanked him back with brutal speed. His scream was cut off almost instantly as Peter's claws pierced his throat. Blood spattered the ground, and Reddick's body fell limp. Peter left no trace behind, nothing but the silent, predatory satisfaction deep within his chest. Unger, turning back at the absence of his friend's voice, froze at the sight of the empty path. His breath hitched, and he stumbled back, eyes wild as he whispered, "Reddick." But there was only darkness. A soft growl rumbled from the shadows, low and menacing, and Unger's gaze snapped toward the sound. Then he turned to run, crashing through the underbrush, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. But Peter was faster, his eyes locked on his prey. Just as Unger reached a clearing, Peter struck, his claws digging into Unger's ankles, yanking him off his feet and dragging him towards a flaming trash can. Unger screamed, his hands clawing at the ground, eyes wide as he caught sight of the twisted face of the alpha, its jaws pulled back in a snarling grin. The firelight from the trash can glinted in Peter's eyes, casting an eerie glow across his features. "Please don't," Unger begged, his voice breaking as Peter held him by the ankles, lifting him easily. For a moment, Peter seemed to savor his fear, holding him there, savoring his pleas, his voice raw and desperate. Then, with a cold finality, Peter released his hold, sending Unger crashing down into the flaming barrel. His screams echoed through the woods, a fitting tribute to the monster they had created. When the fire died, Peter turned back to the shadows, his task complete. And as he left, a mountain lion watched him from a nearby tree, wide-eyed and tense. With a flick of his gaze, Peter drove it off, sending it sprinting toward Beacon Hills High School. After watching the mountain lion crash through the school parking lot, followed closely by Sheriff Stalinsky and Chris Argent, Peter smirked. He melted into the night and went back to the hospital, his cover as an injured patient in place once again, a thin layer shielding the deadly alpha hidden beneath. Styles' POV. The morning light filtered into Styles' room, but he had been awake long before dawn, his mind racing as he recalled every recent attack, every grim detail his father had shared. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. His dad's office was empty, and Styles took the opportunity to slip inside, cracking open files his dad would never let him see. Cases classified as animal attacks, each stranger than the last. Laura Hale, Garrison Myers, Levesque from Video 2*C, and now a new victim added just this morning, Reddick. Styles found out that his dad discovered that Laura Hale, Garrison Myers, Levesque, and now the two new names he just added this morning, Reddick and Unger, all of them had ties to the Hale fire. But Styles knew the truth. This wasn't just any animal, it was the alpha werewolf, killing anyone linked to that night. This wasn't random. It was calculated revenge, one attack at a time. A shiver ran down Styles' spine. His dad didn't know about the alpha, and he couldn't tell him. His dad still believed the attacks were caused by some wild animal, and Styles wasn't about to complicate things by explaining the existence of werewolves. That knowledge would stay between him and Scott. But as he scanned through the files again, a new thought chilled him to the core. His dad's notes listed 3 other victims, cases marked as animal attacks, but with something distinctly different about them. The first was a woman found with her throat mauled, every drop of blood in her body mysteriously drained. The second and third cases were even stranger. 2 people found with their stomachs ripped open, their liver and spleen missing, their bodies left to die slowly. A new kind of monster, he thought. Styles sat back, his mind racing, replaying the details over and over. If these deaths weren't connected to the Alpha, then Beacon Hills had another supernatural killer in town, something else lurking in the shadows, preying on the unsuspecting. The cold, creeping fear twisted in his gut. The Alpha was bad enough, but a creature that hunted for organs, leaving its victims drained and brutalized, felt even worse. He thought of his dad, of Melissa, of Lydia and Jackson, people who had no idea what was out there in the dark. If the Alpha didn't get them, maybe this new creature would. "I need to tell Scott," he muttered to himself, his voice a little shaky. He needed to talk to someone, share this weight, even if only to feel a little less like the world was spinning out of control. This was more than he had bargained for. Styles closed the files, making sure everything looked untouched. He knew he'd have to tell Scott soon. Whatever was out there, Scott could probably get rid of it. Scott's POV. Scott's heart was still pounding after telling Allison everything. It felt like a massive weight had finally lifted, yet he was nervous too. Allison was in his arms, wrapped up in his world of secrets. He looked into her eyes and gently asked, "Allison, how do you feel about all of this?" She sighed, shaking her head slightly. "I don't know how to feel, Scott. Yesterday, I was just a normal high school girl worried about exams and what to wear, and now, the supernatural is real. My boyfriend's a werewolf, and worse, my family hunts werewolves like you for centuries. And I'm supposed to be a hunter, Scott. How do you expect me to feel?" Scott scratched the back of his head, searching for the right words to console her. "I'm sorry I told you." He cringed at how unsure he sounded. Allison laughed, lightening the mood. "No, silly. I'm glad you told me. Just promise me, no more secrets, okay? We're in this together, right?" Scott's face softened, and he felt the surge of relief in his chest. "Yeah, together." He grinned and teased, "You know, I think you'll make one hell of a hunter." Allison raised her brows. "How so?" Scott chuckled. "Well, you didn't even know you were a hunter, and you already caught a werewolf. And not just any werewolf, a very strong alpha." "Oh really?" she said, smiling as she leaned closer. "And just how did I catch him?" Scott's grin widened. "You stole my heart. Now, even if I wanted to escape, I couldn't." She laughed. "That's cheesy, but I like it." They gazed at each other, and before they knew it, Scott leaned in, pressing his lips to hers. The kiss deepened, each of them forgetting the world for a few precious moments, until Scott's phone rang, startling them both. Allison pulled back, glancing down at the buzzing phone. "Are you going to get that?" she teased. Scott rolled his eyes. "Probably just Styles. Can we ignore him?" She laughed. "You should answer. Maybe it's urgent." Scott groaned. "Fine. But if it's not, I swear, I'm going to kill him." He picked up the call. "Hey, Styles. What's up? I'm kind of busy." Styles's voice was fast, his tone urgent. "Where are you, dude? We need to meet. Like right now." "Can't it wait?" Scott asked, glancing at Allison with a hopeful smile. "Well, if you're busy, I guess it's okay. But you know, by the time you're done, half of Beacon Hills might be dead." Allison heard that and whispered in Scott's ear, "We can continue this later. Go see what's going on with Styles." She playfully bit his ear. "You're not making this easier," he murmured, smirking at her. Then he said to Styles, "All right, fine. Where are you?" "Come to my house," Styles replied quickly. Scott sighed. "This better be important. If it's not, I'm beating your ass." He hung up and turned to Allison. "Let's go see what he wants." "Am I coming too?" she asked, surprised. Scott nodded. "Yeah, now that you know the truth about Beacon Hills, you should come. Besides, it'll give you a chance to see more of this world." Allison grinned, clearly excited but trying to hide it. Okay, let's go. But Scott, does Styles know? Scott laughed sheepishly. Yeah, he knew before you. Allison raised an eyebrow, pouting. You told him first? Scott fumbled for an excuse, scratching the back of his head. He was with me when I was bitten. Allison eyed him suspiciously, but then chuckled. Fine. I believe you for now. She sprinted towards his car, laughing as Scott chased after her. He caught up, scooping her up as she giggled and playfully spanked her. That's for doubting me, he teased. Laughing, Allison clung to his back as he carried her to his Camaro. They drove to Styles' house, singing along to the music and laughing together until they arrived. Styles was already waiting outside, pacing anxiously. The second Scott stepped out, Styles grabbed him by the arm, pulling him to the side. Scott, why is Allison here? He whispered, clearly panicked. I need to talk to you about the Alpha and other supernatural things. Scott grinned. She was with me when you called, and I've already told her everything. Everything? Styles asked, eyes wide. Like your wolfy side and all that? Scott nodded, and Styles hit him on the back of his head. Are you crazy? She's a hunter, as in, she hunts stupid-ass werewolves like you. Scott chuckled. She's not a hunter. And even if she were, she wouldn't hurt me. Styles rolled his eyes. Sure, and maybe she won't stab you at night, either. Scott smirked. No, the only one doing any stabbing will be me. He and Styles burst into laughter, until Allison cleared her throat, standing there with her arms crossed. I'd appreciate it if you two idiots didn't talk about me like I wasn't here. She raised an eyebrow, clearly amused but faking a stern look. Now, Scott, what was that about stabbing? Nothing, babe. Just Styles being dramatic, Scott said quickly, trying to act innocent. She gives Scott a playful warning glare. We'll talk about this later. Scott scratched the back of his head, smirking. Thanks a lot, Styles. Now I'm in trouble. Styles grinned. Hey, you did that to yourself, buddy. As the banter died down, Styles looked uncertainly at Allison, as if unsure whether he could really trust her with everything he was about to reveal. Allison noticed, rolled her eyes and then smirked at Styles. Don't worry, Styles. I'd never hurt Scott. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't. She looked at Scott, her cheeks pink. Because, well. Scott reached over, taking her hand. And I'd never hurt you, Allison. They shared a quiet, sweet look until Styles interrupted, pretending to gag. Ugh, can you two please stop? You're hurting the feelings of a single person here. Scott and Allison burst out laughing, and Styles, despite his teasing, smiled. Come on in, he said, leading them inside. As they walked up to his room, Scott whispered to Allison, just a warning, Styles's room is a bit creepy. Allison raised an eyebrow. Creepy? How so? He keeps crime scene files, Scott explained, smirking. He swipes them from his dad and copies them. You might find pictures of dead people lying around. Styles turned around, blushed under Allison's bemused stare. Hey, don't judge me. I only keep those files because I'm solving cases. It's a hobby, okay? And usually, there aren't any creepy photos lying around. Usually. Allison crossed her arms, looking skeptical. So we're not going to find any creepy photos today. Styles scratched the back of his head, looking a little sheepish. Well, maybe just this time. Then he got serious, taking a deep breath. Actually, that's why I called you here. There's something I found this morning in my dad's files, and it's big. He led them over to a small stack of police reports on his desk, the papers covered in notes and highlighted details. Scott and Allison exchanged a look before Scott nodded. All right, Styles. What did you find? Styles took a deep breath, his voice lower, his tone filled with tension. Scott. Allison. I think I've got a lead on what the Alpha's been doing. And it's bigger than just random killing. And there is more than just the Alpha. The quiet in Styles' room was broken only by the rustling of papers as he set them in front of Scott and Allison, looking both tense and excited. Okay, so here's what my dad found. He took a deep breath, his finger landing on a page marked with names. Turns out, every recent animal attack victim had ties to the Hale fire. He ticked off on his fingers, Garrison Myers, Levesque, and the new ones, Reddick and Unger. They were all connected to what happened to the Hale family. And then, of course, there's Laura Hale. Well, she was a Hale. Scott nodded, his expression serious. Allison's eyes widened as she gasped. Wait, Stiles, are you saying that these attacks aren't from an animal? Exactly, Stiles confirmed, his voice dropping to a whisper. This wasn't just some rogue mountain lion. We know it's the Alpha. And I'm willing to bet your family does too. Allison's face paled. And this Alpha you're talking about, who is he? Remember that night? The thing outside your window? That was him. Scott said. Allison's breath caught in her throat, a shiver running through her. Scott reached for her hand, his grip reassuring. He won't come near you again. I made sure of it. Allison relaxed slightly, managing a nod. Do we know his identity? She asked. Stiles leaned forward. That's exactly what I wanted to tell you both. The Alpha isn't just killing anyone. These murders are revenge, all aimed at people involved in the Hale fire. He glanced at Scott before lowering his voice. And you know what that means. I think the Alpha is a Hale. Allison looked confused. This Hale fire you keep talking about, what exactly happened? Stiles glanced between Scott and Allison, his voice somber as he explained. 6 years ago, there was a fire at the Hale house. The Hale family was inside. They didn't make it. Scott nodded, adding, the Hale family wasn't just any family, Allison. They were a pack of werewolves, led by an Alpha named Talia Hale. She wasn't just strong, she was the guardian of Beacon Hills and respected by both werewolves and hunters alike. Allison's brows furrowed, sadness clouding her gaze. So she and her family, they all died? Stiles shook his head. Not all of them. Talia's son Derek and her daughter Laura managed to escape. They left Beacon Hills after the fire, but Laura came back and ended up dead in the woods. And now Derek's back too. Allison's eyes widened as she put the pieces together. So that dead body they found in the woods, that was her? Yes, Stiles confirmed grimly. Turning to Scott, Stiles whispered urgently, Scott, I think the Alpha is Derek Hale. It has to be him. Scott shook his head firmly. No, it's not Derek. Remember his eyes. Stiles slapped his forehead in sudden realization. Right, his eyes are blue. Allison tilted her head, suspicion in her eyes. Doesn't that make him more suspicious? Didn't you tell me that when a werewolf takes an innocent life, their eyes turn blue? Scott nodded. Yes, but that only happens for betas. An Alpha's eyes stay red, no matter what they do. So, Allison said slowly, even if he's not the Alpha, that Derek is probably a bad guy, right? Stiles shrugged. Most likely. Scott looked at them both with a serious expression. Listen to me, both of you. Not all blue-eyed werewolves are cold-blooded killers. Say a werewolf accidentally hits someone with a car. The guilt would turn their eyes blue. Or if they saw someone they loved being killed and did nothing because they were scared, their eyes would turn blue too. Stiles was quiet for a moment, letting that sink in. So, it's not always about killing. Guilt can do it too. Exactly, Scott nodded. Don't judge every werewolf by the color of their eyes. Stiles sighed, glancing at Allison. But if the Alpha isn't Derek, then who is it? Scott hesitated. He'd known the truth from the start, but wasn't sure how or when to reveal it. After a moment's pause, he spoke. Actually, I know who the Alpha is. Stiles looked like he'd been hit by a truck. You've known this whole time. He grabbed Scott by the collar, half in disbelief and half in frustration. And you didn't tell me? Calm down, Stiles. Scott pried his hands off, grinning despite the tension. I was going to tell you. Stiles crossed his arms, still looking miffed. Fine. When did you find out? Scott glanced at Allison. A few days ago. Allison mentioned seeing a bear with red eyes outside her window. I figured it was the Alpha, so I went to track him. The scent led me to the hospital. The hospital? Styles blinked, leaning in. So who is he? Scott took a deep breath. Peter Hale. Derek's uncle. He was in the house during the fire and ended up burned and in a coma for years. But he's not in a coma anymore. He killed Laura, took her Alpha Spark, and he is hiding in the hospital, pretending to be in a coma to avoid suspicion. Styles let out a low whistle. So, what did you do after you found him? A smirk played on Scott's lips. I beat him half to death and told him to stay away from Allison. Allison's cheeks flushed as she reached over to give Scott a hug and a kiss. Styles rolled his eyes, unable to resist a snarky comment. Oh sure, Scott. Tell the Alpha to stay away from your girlfriend. Did you even tell him not to kill poor little me? Scott laughed. Don't worry, Styles. I told him if he touched anyone close to me, he'd be dead. He won't come near you, my mom, or your dad. He knows better. Styles leaned back, exhaling a sigh of relief. All right, but why didn't you stop him from, killing people? Scott's gaze darkened. Because except for Laura, he hasn't killed anyone innocent. He's taking revenge on the people who murdered his family. And Styles, you know what those monsters did, right? They burned werewolves, regular humans, and even children alive. They watched them burn to death. Allison's voice softened, her eyes full of sorrow. That's horrible. They deserve whatever he does to them. Scott's eyes met hers, a flicker of pity in his gaze. He knew one of those involved was her Aunt Kate, someone Allison loved. He hesitated, wondering if he should tell her. What is it, Scott? She asked, noticing his look. He took her hand gently. There's someone else involved. Someone at the heart of all of this. But I think you and Styles should figure it out yourselves. Allison's brow furrowed. Why can't you just tell me? Scott squeezed her hand. Trust me. Once you find out who it is, you'll understand why I didn't just come out and say it. Allison took a shaky breath, nodding. All right. I'll look into it. Don't worry about Peter Hale for now and help Allison find the one responsible for that fire, Scott said, glancing at Styles. Styles looked determined, glancing between Scott and Allison. Got it. We'll start digging. Then, just as they were settling back, Styles's expression shifted, and he swallowed hard, almost nervously. There's actually something else I need to tell you, Scott. Something I found in my dad's files that, well, it's even scarier than the Alpha. The room fell silent as both Scott and Allison stared at him, anticipation thick in the air. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in Styles' room, casting stripes of light across the walls. Scott leaned against the desk, as Styles flipped through the files he copied from his dad. Allison sat on the edge of the bed, still processing everything she learned about the Hale fire and the Alpha werewolf. Here is what I found. Styles slid a picture across the desk towards Scott and Allison. This is the first victim. Take a look. Scott picked up the picture and Allison leaned closer, her face contorting into a mixture of horror and confusion. The image showed a pale woman lying in the woods with wounds on her neck, her lifeless eyes staring into nothing. Isn't this just like the victims of the Alpha? Allison asked hesitantly. Styles shook his head. No. The wounds might look a bit similar, but here's the creepy part. After the autopsy, they found that every single drop of blood in her body was completely drained. Scott straightened, his demeanor shifting to something more serious. What about the other victims? How many are there? 2 others besides her, Styles said, pulling out 2 more pictures and laying them on the desk. Allison winced as she looked at the photos. That's gruesome, she murmured. Scott studied the images carefully. Wait, there's blood around these 2. If they were drained, why is there so much blood? They weren't drained like the first victim. Something ripped open their stomachs, took their liver and spleen, and then just left them to die slowly. Styles said. Allison's hand flew to her mouth, her voice trembling. That's terrifying. Styles shrugged, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Welcome to our lives, Allison. It's a non-stop freak show. You're gonna love it. Allison rolled her eyes. Not helping Styles. She turned to Scott, her gaze filled with concern. Do you have any idea what could have done this? Scott rubbed his chin, his thoughts racing. There are a lot of supernatural creatures that drink human blood or eat human flesh. Vampires, wendigos, ghouls. It could be any of them. Styles raised an eyebrow. Okay, vampires I know about, and I've seen a ghoul. But what's a wendigo? Scott explained, a wendigo is a cannibalistic monster from folklore. It's a fearsome beast that stalks and eats humans. Styles let out a dramatic sigh and wrapped his arms around Scott in an exaggerated hug. Scott frowned. Dude? What are you doing? I'm saying goodbye, Styles said, pulling back with a smirk. Because I'm packing up and moving to Canada with my dad. Scott burst out laughing. Good luck with that. Fun fact, wendigos are a Canadian thing. So if you're running from one, Canada's the last place you want to go. Styles groaned and collapsed onto his bed. Great. Can't even escape to Canada. Allison chuckled, her tension easing slightly. Scott, are you going to do something about this? Scott's smile faded, replaced by determination. Yeah. Beacon Hills is our home. I'm not letting something this dangerous roam around killing people. Styles sat up. What's the plan? Scott looked at the photos again. Which murder happened most recently? This one, Styles said, pointing to the image of a bloodied man in a dark alley. He is one of the two who got their organs taken. Take me to the crime scene, Scott said. The three got into Styles' Jeep, driving through Beacon Hills to the crime scene, a back alley behind a local bar, still sealed off with yellow police tape. The smell of alcohol and garbage lingered in the air. Scott stepped out and approached the scene. Styles and Allison followed, watching him carefully. Styles crossed his arms. So, are you getting anything, Scott? Give me a second, Scott said, his voice low. He closed his eyes, letting his senses take over, as he inhaled deeply, searching for anything out of the ordinary. Suddenly, his eyes flashed a bright crimson, and a low growl escaped his throat. Allison flinched but quickly approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Scott, are you okay? Scott turned his glowing red eyes to her and nodded. I'm fine, he said, his voice softer. And he pulled her into a hug. Styles, however, was less convinced. You sure about that, buddy? Because you look like you're about to rip someone's head off. Scott let out a breath, his eyes returning to normal. I'm fine, Styles. You look angry, Styles said, eyeing him warily. Are you losing control? Scott smirked, shaking his head. You know I don't lose control, Styles. Then what's with the whole glowing eyes growling like a wild animal thing? Scott hesitated. It's hard to explain. Whatever did this isn't a ghoul. It's worse. The second I caught its scent, something inside me reacted. Every part of me was screaming to kill it. It's like a primal instinct, as if nature itself wants it dead. Both Allison and Styles shivered at his words. Styles cleared his throat. Okay, but can you track it? Follow the scent or something. Scott tried, moving further into the alley, his senses on high alert. After a few moments, he stopped, frustration etched on his face. No. The scent's gone. It just vanished, like the thing disappeared into thin air. Styles frowned. Great. That's not ominous or anything. Scott turned back to them. Let's go see Deaton. He might know what we're dealing with. Allison tilted her head. Who's Deaton? He's the veterinarian I work for, Scott explained. But he's also a druid, a kind of supernatural advisor. Druids know a lot about creatures like this. As they walked back to the Jeep, Scott filled Allison in on druids and their role in the supernatural world. Scott said, if anyone can figure out what we're up against, it's him. They drove toward the animal clinic, the weight of the new threat hanging heavily in the air. Scott, Styles, and Allison pulled up in front of the animal clinic. Scott led the way, pushing the glass door open, a small bell jingling overhead. Inside, Deaton stood near a metal examination table, talking quietly with Derek. Scott raised a hand. Hey, document. Deaton glanced up with a small smile. Scott? You don't have a shift today. What brings you here? Scott smiled, and said, I need a little help from you, document. Then he turned to Derek, an amused smirk playing on his lips. Derek, What are you doing here? Don't tell me you got shot again. Styles' face lit up in a mischievous grin as he snickered. Allison leaned closer to Scott and whispered, again. Scott chuckled. How do I put this? You're crazy and shot him. Allison's eyes widened in shock. Kate? Seriously? Scott shrugged. Remember that time at dinner when I said Styles found a wounded dog and I had to help? Well, that dog was Derek. For a moment, Allison simply stared, processing the information. Then she slapped a hand over her mouth, stifling a giggle. Her shoulders began shaking as quiet laughter bubbled out. Styles couldn't hold back anymore. He burst into laughter, clutching his stomach. Ha ha ha, Derek, he called you a... Derek glared at Styles, cutting him off mid-sentence. Styles squeaked and quickly ducked behind Scott. Scott smirked and shook his head. I was having dinner with the Argents, Derek. I wasn't exactly going to tell them I had to go help a wounded werewolf. Scott shrugged. Why are you here, anyway? Derek snorted. I'm here to ask Deaton some questions. Am I not allowed to be here, Scott? Scott raised an eyebrow. As long as you're not trying to harm Deaton, I've got no problem. He tilted his head. What are you asking about? Derek hesitated, his gaze flicking to Allison. Scott sighed and gestured toward her. Don't worry about her. She's with me. Allison, this is Derek Hale. Derek, this is Allison Argent. For a moment, the room fell into an awkward silence. Finally, Allison broke it, her voice soft but sincere. Nice to meet you. I've heard about what happened to your family. I'm sorry. Derek's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. Scott quickly cleared his throat, stepping between them. Derek, he pressed, steering the conversation back. What are you asking about? When Derek still didn't answer, Deaton spoke up. He's asking about the Alpha. Scott raised an eyebrow. Oh well, we know who the Alpha is. Derek's head snapped toward Scott. What? Who is it? Scott smirked. Oh, now you want to talk to me? Derek didn't know what to say. He couldn't force Scott to tell him, so he just looked at him anxiously. Scott sighed. Fine. Styles, fill him in. Styles eagerly stepped forward, explaining everything. He detailed how all the Alpha's victims were connected to the Hale family, how Scott had confronted the Alpha in the hospital, and finally, the moment of truth. Derek, I'm sorry to say this. Styles said, his voice softening, but the Alpha, it's your Uncle Peter. Derek's face twisted in disbelief. Impossible. He would never, he couldn't have killed Laura. Scott leaned against the counter, his expression serious. He's been in a coma for years, Derek. Probably having nightmares about the fire every day. The rage, the pain, it must have twisted him. It's the only explanation for what he's doing. But make no mistake, Peter is the Alpha who killed Laura, the one who bit me, and the one killing people in town. Derek's jaw clenched. How can you be so sure? Because I've met him, Scott said, his voice steady. I nearly killed him a few days ago when he got too close to Allison. Derek's expression shifted, the weight of Scott's words sinking in. Finally, he muttered, "Thank you for telling me." He turned to leave. Scott called after him, "Where are you going?" "To see him," Derek said without hesitation. Scott stepped forward. "Wait. Before you go to him and get yourself killed, I need your help with something." Derek frowned. "What is it?" "We discovered that there is an evil creature that feeds on humans in town, and I'm here to see if Deaton can identify it. So listen to what we discovered and see if you know anything about a creature like this," Scott said. Then Scott gestured to Styles. "Show them the pictures." Styles pulled out the photos and spread them across the counter. "This woman," he said, pointing to the first picture, "was drained of every drop of blood." He moved to the other two. "And these two?" "Their livers and spleens were ripped out." Derek studied the images, his brow furrowing. "Could be a Wendigo." He muttered. Deaton picked up the pictures, examining them closely. "The first victim, possibly a vampire," he said finally. "But vampires disappeared long ago. If this is one, they're either incredibly bold or very inexperienced, to let the prey they fed on be discovered like this." Why did you say that they are either bold or very inexperienced? Allison asked. Because the way a vampire kills is very obvious, and once a vampire is discovered in any place, everyone hunts them, be it hunters or werewolves. No one likes a vampire. Deaton answered. Allison nodded. I see. And the other 2 victims? Scott asked. Deaton shook his head. Cannibalistic creatures are numerous. Without more evidence, I can't say for certain. Stiles asked. Doc, you mean there are 2 psychos running around town killing people, not just one? Deaton nodded grimly. Yes, Stiles. It's likely we're dealing with 2 different creatures. Stiles groaned. Fantastic. Scott turned to Derek. Have you ever encountered a supernatural creature that made every part of you scream to kill it, like it was your instinct? Derek's expression shifted slightly. No. But my mother once told me about something that made her feel that way when she was young. What was it? Stiles asked. Derek hesitated. A wechuge. A cannibalistic monster made of ice. She encountered it in Alaska with her pack. They burned it to kill it. Allison's eyes widened. Could that be what we're dealing with? Deaton shook his head. No. Wechuge prefer cold, snowy climates, and they consume their victims entirely. This doesn't match their pattern. Scott sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Since we don't know what it is and can't track it, I'll patrol every night for a while. Maybe I'll get lucky. Allison, Stiles. Don't go out after dark. Got it. Both nodded, their expressions serious. Derek straightened. I have to deal with Peter. Scott placed a hand on his shoulder. Be careful. Peter is stronger than you think. He isn't a normal alpha. You've seen what he can turn into. Derek didn't respond, but gave a small nod before leaving. Scott turned to the others. Okay, I'm starving. Let's grab something to eat. They said their goodbyes to Deaton and headed to a small diner. The 3 of them slid into a booth, the tension finally easing as they placed their orders. As they ate, Allison hesitated before speaking. Should I tell my parents about this? About the creatures? Scott shook his head. They probably already know. And how would you explain how you found out? I don't want them knowing about me. Not yet. Allison nodded slowly. Okay. Don't worry too much, Scott said with a reassuring smile. Whatever these things are, they won't go near the hunters. Derek's POV. Derek slammed the clinic door behind him, his emotions boiling over as he jumped into his car. He drove fast, his mind replaying the conversation with Scott and the others. Scott's confirmation of Peter's actions burned in his thoughts like a wildfire. This ends today, Derek growled, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Arriving at Beacon Hills Memorial Hospital, Derek parked hastily and stormed through the halls, ignoring the curious glances of nurses and patients. He approached Peter's room and pushed open the door without hesitation. Inside, Peter sat quietly on a wheelchair. His was motionless, giving no hint of his predatory nature. Derek approached him, his breathing heavy, his rage barely contained. Peter. Derek whispered, stepping closer to the man who had once been his mentor and family, but was now a monster in his eyes. He stared at Peter for a moment, his emotions in turmoil, before his claws extended. With a growl, he lashed out, aiming for Peter's throat. Peter's hand shot up with inhuman speed, catching Derek's wrist mid-swing. What do you think you're doing, Derek? He said, his voice low and menacing. Derek's glowing blue eyes flared as he pulled back, preparing for another strike. You killed her. You killed Laura. Peter pushed Derek back. It wasn't what you think. I don't care. Derek roared, his fangs elongating as he lunged again. Peter met him head-on, his movements fluid and powerful. Derek fought with everything he had, but Peter's superior strength as an alpha quickly overwhelmed him. With a brutal swipe, Peter sent Derek crashing into the wall. Derek struggled to his feet, clutching his side where Peter's claws had raked him. You're a monster, Derek spat. Peter's expression darkened. And you're weak. He took a deep breath, and his scars from the fire vanished before Derek's eyes. Derek froze, watching as Peter's burned skin smoothed and his body radiated strength. What are you doing? Peter smirked. Healing. Something your sister's alpha power helped me accelerate after years of agony. Derek clenched his fists, his hatred for Peter growing with every word. Peter's tone softened, almost apologetic. I didn't mean to kill Laura. I wasn't in my right mind. The fire, the nightmares, it broke me, Derek. All I could think about was revenge. When I saw Laura, I thought her alpha power could give me what I needed to rebuild the Hail Pack and destroy those responsible. I lost control. I'm sorry. Derek's voice cracked with emotion. You're sorry? That's all you have to say. Peter nodded solemnly. I can't undo what I did, but I can find out who caused the fire. Adrian Harris, the chemistry teacher, knows something. We'll go to him tomorrow. Derek hesitated, his desire for revenge warring with his need for answers. Fine, he said reluctantly. As Peter moved to leave, Derek smirked and said, By the way, I heard you had a run-in with Scott. How'd that go? Peter froze, a shiver running down his spine. That kid, he's a monster, Derek. I've never seen or heard of anything like him. Derek raised an eyebrow. You're an alpha who turns into a literal beast. You couldn't defend yourself. Peter's voice dropped to a whisper. You don't understand. He didn't even shift fully, and he was faster and stronger than me. I couldn't land a single hit. Then he shifted and Derek Peter took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly. He looked like what werewolves are meant to be. Towering, majestic, and terrifying. I thought I was big and intimidating in my full werewolf form, but he was something else entirely. In that form, he played with me like a big male lion playing with a newborn calf. He broke my bones with every strike, and when I tried to run, he was there, blocking my way, grinning like it was all a game. Damn, I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. Derek laughed. He really gave you a good beating, didn't he? Peter sighed, his pride wounded. He left me almost dead, Derek. Even with my alpha powers, I've only just managed to heal completely today. Let's not talk about that stupid kid anymore. You'll understand if you ever get on his bad side. Derek shook his head. I'm not stupid enough to do that. Scott's POV the next morning, after class, Scott leaned against his locker, waiting for Allison. He was enjoying the calm when Jackson strode up, his usual smug expression in place. I know what you are, McCall, Jackson said with a sly grin. Scott raised an eyebrow, smirking. Oh yeah? What's that, Jackson? Jackson leaned in, lowering his voice. You're a werewolf. Scott chuckled, crossing his arms. Go on. Jackson's confidence faltered slightly at Scott's lack of panic, but he quickly recovered and said, I've seen the thing that killed that guy at the video store. And not long ago, one of your friends came to school looking for you. He was in bad shape, and I thought he was a drug dealer. I told him I hadn't seen you, and he got angry. His eyes glowed blue, and I swear I heard him growl. After that, I did some research, and everything points to you and your friends being werewolves. Scott's face twisted into mock shock. Whoa, wait a second. You? Doing research? Now that's the real mystery here. He broke into laughter. Jackson, you just made my day. Ha ha ha. Jackson's face reddened with anger. Cut the crap, McCall. I don't care how you do it. A bite, a scratch, or some kind of magic fairy dust. But you're going to make me like you, or I'll make sure Allison finds out everything. Scott stopped laughing, wiping a tear from his eye as he composed himself. You know, Jackson, I can't tell if you're ignorant or just plain stupid. Let's assume, for fun, that I'm exactly what you think, a werewolf. Do you really think threatening me is your best move? He leaned in slightly, a wicked smile spreading across his face. What if I turned into a wolf right here and dragged your sorry ass into the woods, in front of everyone, and killed you? Or better yet, what if I show up in your room at night as that thing you said you saw at the video store, and put you to sleep permanently? Now, what do you think would happen to me then, Jackson? Jackson's face drained of color, his eyes widening in fear as the weight of his mistake dawned on him. Scott smirked, his tone mocking. Let me save you the trouble. They'll say, poor Jackson Whitmore, killed by a wolf or a mountain lion got into his room and killed him. And I'll walk away, no questions asked. Do you get it now, or do I need to spell it out for you? Jackson stammered, unable to respond, his fear evident. At that moment, Allison appeared, wrapping her arms around Scott and kissing him on the cheek. She glanced at Jackson. "What's wrong with him?" Scott grinned. "Oh, nothing. Jackson here thought I was a werewolf and threatened to tell you unless I turned him into one." Allison blinked in surprise before bursting into laughter. "You seriously thought Scott was a werewolf and then threatened him? You are either really brave or really stupid." She hugged Scott tightly and said with a soft smile, "But even if Scott is a werewolf, I'll still love him." Then, without hesitation, Allison leaned in, kissed Scott deeply, and teased, "Let's go, my cute wolf." With a playful laugh, she spun around and darted toward the cafeteria. Scott laughed, howling playfully. "Whoa. Wait for me, babe." He chased after her, leaving Jackson frozen in place, pale-faced and muttering to himself, "Was I dropped on my head as a child?" The cafeteria buzzed with its usual lunchtime chatter as Scott, Allison, and Styles sat at their table. Allison absently picked at her food while Styles, ever the ball of energy, tried to engage her in conversation. Across from them sat Lydia, her usually vibrant demeanor replaced by a visible cloud of sadness. Scott noticed and leaned closer to Allison, lowering his voice. "What's up with her?" he asked, gesturing subtly toward Lydia. Allison sighed. "Jackson broke up with her. Through a text." Scott's brow furrowed, his lips curling into a disgusted sneer. What a coward. He couldn't even do it face to face. Then Scott said, "Lydia is better off. She is way too smart for someone like Jackson." Lydia, overhearing, snapped her head up and glared at Scott. "Mind your own business, McCall. Do I look like I need you to comfort me?" Scott raised his hands in mock surrender, a smirk playing on his lips. "No, you definitely don't look like it. But I can feel it, Lydia. Your energy's all off, and it's bumming me out." Lydia's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What did you just say?" Scott shrugged nonchalantly. "Nothing." Before Lydia could retaliate, Scott turned his attention to Allison, who was engrossed in a thick book. "What are you reading, babe?" Allison glanced up and smiled. "It's about La Bête du Gavaudan. After you told me that story the other day, I wanted to learn more." Scott leaned closer to look at the book. "Where'd you find this?" "Oh, it was in my dad's study," Allison replied casually. Styles, meanwhile, attempted to strike up a conversation with Lydia, only to be met with cold indifference. The awkward silence was broken when Scott suddenly laughed. "What's so funny?" Allison asked, curious. Scott shook his head. "Nothing. Come on, let's go. We've got guests to meet." The trio bid Lydia goodbye, leaving her to her thoughts, and followed Scott out to the lacrosse field. When they arrived, Derek and Peter Hale were already waiting. Derek stood stoically with his arms crossed, while Peter looked unusually uneasy. Scott grinned widely, his tone dripping with playful sarcasm. "Derek. Still alive, huh? But what's with the company?" Derek snorted, but didn't respond. Peter, however, shifted uncomfortably under Scott's gaze, a subtle shiver running through him. Scott chuckled. "I see. If you can't beat them, join them, right?" Allison, confused, pointed at Peter. "Who's that?" Scott's grin widened. "That babe is Peter Hale." Allison's eyes widened in recognition. She instinctively moved closer to Scott, her body tense with wariness. "Peter." Styles piped up, his voice laced with disbelief. "The psycho alpha running around killing people? That Peter?" Scott smirked, his gaze locking onto Peter. "What are you doing here?" Peter laughed nervously. "You said as long as I didn't touch your little huntress or anyone close to you, you wouldn't interfere with my revenge. I'm here for that." Scott's expression hardened. "Explain." Derek stepped forward. "Your chemistry teacher, Adrian Harris, was involved in the fire. He might know who's really responsible." Scott nodded. "Fine. Interrogate him. He doesn't have class right now, so you'll find him in his classroom. But let me be crystal clear, I don't care what he did, but there will be no killing on school grounds. Got it?" Peter nodded reluctantly. "Fine." Scott's eyes glowed faintly. "And cover his eyes. We're coming with you." Adrian Harris sat tied to a chair, his eyes covered, trembling with fear. Derek and Peter stood on either side of him, their presence menacing. Scott, Allison, and Stiles slipped into the classroom silently, keeping to the shadows. "Please," Harris stammered, his voice quivering. "If you want money, I can get you money. Just don't kill me." Peter's hand shot out, slapping Harris across the face. "My surname is Hale." Harris froze, terror washing over him. Peter leaned closer, his voice cold and dangerous. "You recognize the name, don't you, Harris?" "Please," Harris whimpered. "I didn't do anything. Please don't kill me." Peter's laugh was chilling. "Tell me the truth, and maybe I won't kill you." Harris gulped, his words tumbling out in a rush. Six years ago, I met a woman at a bar. She asked me a lot of questions about chemistry, how to melt locks, dissolve bodies, start fires, and get away with arson. Peter's eyes darkened. "And you answered her questions?" Harris nodded frantically. "I didn't think anything of it. I was so excited to talk to someone who actually seemed interested in chemistry after teaching bored and stupid students year after year. But a week later, the Hale house burned down." Peter's claws extended slightly, grazing Harris's neck. "Her name. Do you know it?" "I don't. I swear." Harris cried. "But she had a pendant, a wolf pendant. A very distinct one. If you find the woman wearing it, you would find the arsonist." Peter slapped him, his voice icy. "She's a murderer, not an arsonist, because arson happens to property, and what she did killed a lot of people, including children." Allison gasped, her body trembling as realization dawned. Scott quickly wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Without a word, he led her and Stiles out of the classroom. After Scott and his friends left, Peter untied Harris. "Draw the pendant for me. Every detail," Peter ordered, his voice cold and commanding. Harris, his hands shaking violently, grabbed the pencil Peter handed him and began sketching. His strokes were uneven, his fear palpable. When he was done, he hesitantly handed the paper back to Peter. Peter studied the drawing, his expression darkening. Without another word, he nodded to Derek. Derek's fist connected with Harris's temple, knocking him out cold. The two walked silently to the lacrosse field, where Scott, Allison, and Stiles were waiting. Peter handed Scott the drawing of the pendant. Scott studied it briefly before showing it to Allison and Stiles. The moment Allison saw the pendant, her face went pale. Her hands trembled as she clutched Scott's arm, tears welling in her eyes. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, confirming what she had feared. Scott's jaw tightened, and he handed the drawing back to Peter without a second glance. His tone was sharp. "You can leave now, Peter." Peter's gaze shifted to Allison, who was visibly shaking. "Your little girlfriend doesn't look so good, Scott," he remarked, his voice laced with a hint of malice. Scott didn't even look at him. Instead, he pulled Allison closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Derek, take your uncle and leave." Peter ignored the warning. "I know who the woman is, Scott. I had my suspicions before, but now I'm certain. She's Kate Argent. And I'm going after her, even if it kills me." Scott's glowing red eyes turned to Peter, silencing him. His voice, cold and deadly. "Do whatever you want, Peter. But hear this, if you hurt Victoria or Chris, you'll wish you were dead. And Kate, she's not an easy prey." Peter's arrogance flared, but before he could respond, Scott's patience snapped. In a blur of motion, Scott lunged forward, gripping Peter by the neck and hoisting him off the ground effortlessly. Peter gasped, his bravado crumbling as Scott's claws dug into his flesh. Scott's voice was a dangerous whisper. "I'm not in the mood, Peter. Say one more word, and I'll make sure you don't walk out of here alive." Peter's confidence evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. Derek hesitated but stepped forward, cautiously. His voice was pleading. "Scott." Scott's glowing eyes shifted to Derek. After a tense pause, he released Peter, letting him fall to the ground with a thud. Derek gave a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you." He grabbed Peter by the arm and dragged him away. Peter stumbled but couldn't resist one final glance at Scott. He remembered that Scott wasn't just a high school kid. He was a force of nature, a monster in the truest sense. As soon as they were gone, Allison broke down completely. She collapsed into Scott's arms. Her tears were streaming down her face. Her sobs racked her body, and Scott held her tightly. Stiles stood nearby, watching the scene with a mixture of sadness and understanding. Quietly, he placed a hand on Scott's shoulder. "Take care of her, man." Scott nodded. As Stiles walked back toward the school, he spotted Jackson approaching from a distance. Jackson had seen everything that happened in the field, Scott lifting Peter like a chicken and his glowing red eyes that radiated danger. Despite the earlier warnings and the sheer terror he'd felt, Jackson's greed and longing to become a werewolf like Scott overrode his common sense. This time, Jackson thought to himself, "I'll offer him money and ask politely. That'll work." But before he could get close, Stiles stepped into his path, blocking him. "Don't," Stiles said flatly, his voice carrying a rare seriousness. "If you value your life, don't bother them right now." Jackson hesitated, his eyes darting back to the field where Scott held a trembling Allison in his arms. The memory of Scott's red glowing eyes and how effortlessly he had dominated Peter replayed in his mind. His survival instincts kicked in. Gritting his teeth, Jackson nodded stiffly and turned away, muttering under his breath about timing and next time. Stiles shook his head and headed back toward the school, leaving Jackson to sulk in silence. The air in the lacrosse field was still, broken only by the soft sound of Allison's quiet sobs. Scott held her tightly, his warmth shielding her from the chill of her emotions. He didn't say anything, knowing words wouldn't soothe her pain right now. He just waited, offering his silent support as her tears slowed. When her crying finally subsided, Scott loosened his hold just enough to look down at her. "How are you feeling, Allison?" Allison pulled away, her face streaked with tears and red with frustration. "How do I feel?" she repeated, her voice rising with anger. "I don't know, Scott. My aunt, someone I thought of as a sister, someone I loved, turns out to be a murderer. And now there's a psycho werewolf who wants to kill her, and you." She pushed him, her hands trembling. "You don't want to save her. I know you don't." Scott opened his mouth to reply, but Allison's frustration boiled over, and she started hitting him on the chest with her fists. "How do you think I should feel, Scott?" Her voice cracked, and she broke down crying again, her hits becoming weaker until her hands fell to her sides. Scott didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her again, holding her tightly despite her initial resistance. "It's okay," he murmured softly, waiting patiently for her storm of emotions to calm. When she stopped shaking, Scott gently tilted her chin up to meet his gaze. "Allison, look at me." She hesitated, keeping her face buried in his chest. Scott persisted, his tone soft. "Please, Allison. Look at me." Reluctantly, she met his eyes, her own still brimming with unshed tears. Scott sighed and said, "Allison, I don't like your Aunt Kate. In fact, I hate her for what she did. She didn't just burn innocent werewolves to death. She killed normal humans and children too." Allison's face crumpled with guilt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I lashed out at you. If I were you, I'd hate her too." Scott reached out, wiping the tears from her cheeks. His voice softened further. "But if you want me to save her life, I will." Her eyes widened in surprise. "You'd do that?" He smiled faintly. "Of course I would. For you." Allison hugged him tightly, her voice barely audible. "Thank you. And I'm really sorry for earlier." "Don't worry about it," Scott said. After a moment, Allison pulled back slightly and studied him. "You've known what she did for a while, haven't you? I noticed it the day you met her at my house, but I brushed it off. And then, in Stiles' room, you said you knew who caused that fire. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Did you think I was too weak to handle it?" Scott shook his head. "It wasn't that. I know how much you love that crazy aunt of yours, so I wasn't going to be the idiot who told you she's a psychopathic murderer and broke your heart. Let's be real, if I had told you back then, you'd hate me instead of her and probably break up with me. I'm not that stupid." Allison smiled faintly through her tears. "You think too much. I could never hate you." "Yeah, right," Scott teased. "Said the girl who just beat me up a minute ago for no apparent reason." Allison pouted, hiding her face against his chest again. Then, in a playful act of defiance, she bit him. Scott yelped dramatically, clutching his chest. Ouch, Allison. That's my nipple. Allison couldn't help but giggle, a small smile breaking through her sorrow. But soon, her smile faded, and she sighed deeply. I don't know how to handle this, Scott. How about this? Scott suggested. Take a day or two to process everything. Then gather your family, tell them that you know about them being hunters and that you know about werewolves, and confront Kate about what she did in front of your parents. Lay it all out and see what she has to say. Allison considered his words before nodding. Okay, that's a good idea. Scott grinned. Of course it is. I thought of it. Allison rolled her eyes but smiled. Should we head back to school? Scott raised an eyebrow. Do you want to? No, Allison admitted. I just want to go home. Scott nodded. All right. I'll drive you. At Allison's house, Scott walked her to the door. Victoria greeted them with her usual calm demeanor. Allison, why are you home? Don't you have school this afternoon? I'm not feeling well, Mom. Allison said softly. Victoria's gaze softened. All right. Then she turned to Scott. Thank you for bringing her home, Scott. Would you like to come in? Scott smiled politely. No, thank you, Mrs. Argent. I need to get back to school. Melissa's POV, the hospital was busy as always. Melissa bustled from one task to another until a patient needed blood. She headed to the blood bank, her mind preoccupied with work. But when she opened the door, she froze. Inside, Dr. Eric, the new doctor, stood with red eyes, blood dripping from his mouth. Melissa instinctively wanted to scream, but before she could, he was in front of her. Shoo, he said, covering her mouth. His fangs glinted before he sank them into her neck. Melissa struggled, but the sharp pain gave way to a strange numbness as he drank. When he finally stopped, he looked her in the eyes and commanded, You saw nothing. You came here, took the blood, and left. There's a hickey on your neck. Cover it with a scarf and don't let anyone see it. With that, Dr. Eric vanished, leaving Melissa dazed. She grabbed a blood bag and returned to her duties, her only thought being to hide the hickey on her neck. Scott's POV after school. Scott and Stiles walked to their cars. Are you okay, man? With everything that happened with Allison and all? Stiles asked. Scott nodded. I'm fine. Then he grinned. See you tomorrow, and don't wander around at night. Stiles smirked. Don't worry. Getting my blood sucked or my liver stolen is the last thing I want, so I'm staying home. Scott laughed and headed to work at the animal clinic. After his shift, he went home, showered, and prepared dinner. He waited patiently for his mom to return. When Melissa finally came home, Scott greeted her with a smile. But as she approached, his enhanced senses picked up an odd scent. His eyes drifted to the scarf around her neck, and he noticed how tired she looked. Hey, Scott. What's for dinner tonight? Melissa asked, smiling nervously. Scott frowned. What's with the scarf? I've never seen you wear one before. Melissa hesitated. I just felt cold today, so I bought one. Her heartbeat spiked. Scott's frown deepened. Take it off. It's warm in here. No. Melissa said defensively. Mom, what's wrong? Why are you shouting? I just don't want to take it off, Scott, she snapped. Scott stepped closer, concern etched on his face. I want to see what's wrong with your neck. Melissa tried to back away, but Scott caught her hands. She struggled, but his werewolf strength held her still. Gently but firmly, he removed the scarf, revealing the puncture wounds. Scott's heart dropped. He knew exactly what caused them. Rage and fear bubbled within him. His mom had been attacked by a vampire. Tears filled Melissa's eyes as she tried to explain. It's just a hickey, Scott. I didn't want you to see it. Scott pulled her into a hug, his mind racing. Mom, are you dating anyone? No, Melissa whispered. Then where did the hickey come from? Scott pressed. I don't remember, Melissa admitted, her voice trembling. Scott guided her to the couch, sitting her down. Mom, that's not a hickey. It's a bite. A bite. Melissa repeated, confused. Scott nodded, his jaw tightening. He took a deep breath and thought to himself, it's time. Time to tell her everything. Scott sat beside Melissa on the living room couch, the soft glow of a nearby lamp casting a warm light over their tense faces. His mind raced as he thought about how to ease her into a world she never imagined existed. He took a deep breath and finally spoke, his voice calm but serious. "Mom," Scott began, "did you see the bodies the sheriff's department brought to the hospital?" Melissa looked at him, puzzled. "Yeah, I saw some of them. But what does that have to do with the bite on my neck?" Scott leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Did you see the woman who had all of her blood drained?" Melissa nodded slowly, a chill creeping into her expression. "Yes. What about her?" Scott locked eyes with her. "Do you think an animal could do that, Mom? Do you think a mountain lion would hunt a woman just to suck her blood dry? And could it even suck blood like that?" Melissa frowned, shaking her head. "No, of course not. A mountain lion, or any other animal, couldn't do that." "So what do you think could, Mom?" Scott asked. She faltered, searching for an answer. "I don't know, Scott. A human, maybe? Someone who killed her and tried to make it look like an animal attack." "Scott, stop playing games. Just tell me what's going on." Scott straightened, meeting her eyes with unwavering seriousness. "All right, then. What would you say if I told you it wasn't a human or an animal, but a vampire? The same thing that bit you and drank your blood?" Melissa glared at him, her frustration bubbling over. "This isn't funny, Scott. A vampire? Really?" Scott's expression didn't waver. "Mom, I'm not joking. Vampires are real. The supernatural is real. And I'm part of it too." Her tone turned sharp, almost angry. "Vampires are real, and you're one of them? Stop this nonsense right now, or you'll be grounded." Scott couldn't help but chuckle under his breath, amused by her response. "No, Mom. I'm not a vampire. I'm a werewolf." Melissa opened her mouth to reprimand him, but her words caught in her throat as Scott's eyes glowed a bright, fiery red. Her breath hitched, and she instinctively scooted away, fear flashing across her face. "Don't be afraid, Mom," Scott said gently. "I won't hurt you." For a moment, Melissa just stared at him, her chest rising and falling quickly. Then, summoning her courage, she moved closer again. "I'm not dreaming, am I, Scott?" Scott let his eyes return to normal, flashing her a reassuring smile. "No, Mom. You're not dreaming." Over the next hour, Scott laid everything bare: his transformation, the existence of hunters, the Hale family tragedy, Peter Hale's killing spree, and even the looming threat of other supernatural creatures like vampires. Melissa listened in stunned silence, her emotions shifting between disbelief, fear, and concern. After he finished, she finally asked, her voice trembling, "You don't lose control during the full moon and hurt people, do you?" Scott shook his head. "No, Mom. I don't lose control. Do you want to see what I look like when I shift?" Melissa hesitated, but nodded. "Okay, show me." Scott stood up, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "Don't be afraid, okay? It's still me, no matter how I look." He stepped behind the couch, quickly removing his shirt and pants, leaving them neatly folded. Melissa watched with bated breath as Scott let the transformation take over. His muscles tensed, his form grew larger, and his features shifted until he stood before her in his full werewolf form. Melissa gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Scott, are you still in there?" The towering beast nodded and spoke in a deep, gravelly voice. "Yes, Mom. It's still me. Come closer. Don't be scared." She hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. Tentatively, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his fur. "I thought you'd look terrifying, but you're not. You look like a wolf standing on two legs. A very muscular wolf." Scott chuckled softly, his voice still deep. "Let me show you something even more amazing." Before her eyes, Scott shifted again, his form morphing into a majestic black wolf with glowing red eyes, bigger than any horse she had ever seen. Melissa's breath hitched as she stared at him in awe. "This is magical." The giant wolf lowered his head, gently rubbing it against her shoulder. She laughed softly before grimacing as he gave her a quick lick on the cheek. "Ugh, gross," she exclaimed, playfully swatting his snout. Grabbing his ear, she added in her best mom voice, "Do that again, and you're grounded, mister." Scott whimpered like a scolded puppy, lowering his head in mock obedience. Melissa smiled and scratched behind his ear. "That's a good boy." Scott returned to his human form, putting his clothes back on. "All right, let's eat. I'm starving." As they ate the dinner Scott had prepared, he broached a new subject. "Mom, I'm going to turn you into a werewolf like me. What do you think?" Melissa blinked in surprise. I don't know, Scott." Scott cut her off. "Mom, I told you about the Nemeton tree and how it attracts supernatural creatures. They'll keep coming to Beacon Hills. You were lucky to survive that vampire today. I'm not taking no for an answer. Besides, being a werewolf has its perks. You'll never get sick, you'll heal faster, you'll have a long lifespan, and you'll stay young for a long time." Melissa's eyes widened in shock and excitement. "Stay young for a long time? Why didn't you start with that?" She jumped out of her seat, practically shoving her arm at him. "What are you waiting for, dummy? Bite me now." Scott laughed, shaking his head. "I should have led with that, huh?" "Stop mumbling and do it now," she demanded. "Yes, ma'am." Scott's fangs elongated, and with a gentle but firm motion, he bit her arm. Melissa flinched and shouted, "Ouch. That hurt." "Sorry, Mom," Scott said, chuckling. "Now you need to rest. Tomorrow morning, you'll become like me. Then we'll find out the identity of the vampire that attacked you." Melissa tilted her head. "How?" Scott leaned back in his chair. "I can see the memory that the vampire made you forget by inserting my claws at the back of your neck. I can do it now, but your neck wouldn't heal, so we'll wait until you've become a werewolf." Melissa sighed, her nerves settling. "And after that? We hunt the bastard," Scott said confidently. Melissa paled. "Hunt him? Isn't that dangerous? And what do we do with him after?" Scott met her gaze. "It is a bit dangerous, but we have to stop him from killing more people. I suspect he's the one who murdered that woman in the woods. As for what to do with him after hunting him, I'm planning to let you steal his powers if you have the ability to take other creatures' powers like I do. A vampire that can compel others is probably strong enough to make you an alpha. That way, I can be more certain about your safety. Then we'll kill him." "Scott!" Melissa exclaimed. "We can't just kill people." Scott looked at her seriously and said, "We can't give him to the sheriff, and we can't let something that dangerous roam free. What I can promise you is that I will never take an innocent life. Now that you're part of the supernatural world, you need to understand, not all supernatural creatures are good. Some are pure evil, and we have to protect ourselves, and the ordinary people if we can." Melissa sighed, reluctantly nodding. "Fine. I'll help you." Scott smiled. "Go take a shower and get some rest. I'll stay with you tonight to make sure you're okay." Later, as Melissa lay in bed, she glanced at Scott, who sat in a chair by her bedside. "Scott, will it hurt? Turning into a werewolf?" Scott shook his head, his tone reassuring. "No, Mom. It won't hurt. You'll get a fever and maybe sweat a bit, but that's it. Now stop worrying and get some sleep." Melissa smiled faintly. "Good night, Scott." "Good night, Mom," he replied softly, watching as she drifted off. Melissa woke to the warm rays of the morning sun filtering through her curtains. Her body felt different, energized, alive in a way she had never experienced. Sitting up, she realized she was drenched in sweat. A shower is definitely the first thing I need, she thought. As she swung her legs over the side of the bed, a curious sound reached her ears, a familiar humming. For a moment, she thought Scott was still in her room, but when she focused, she realized the sound was coming from downstairs. "Wait, I can hear him so clearly." Intrigued, Melissa concentrated, and the humming grew sharper, along with the faint clatter of pans and the sizzle of food in the kitchen. She could even smell the aroma of bacon and eggs wafting through the house as if she were standing right next to the stove. Standing up, Melissa stretched, her muscles feeling lighter, stronger, as if a weight had been lifted. "This is amazing," she whispered, running her hands down her arms, marveling at the strength coursing through her veins. Then her nose wrinkled. A sour smell caught her attention. Confused, she sniffed the air and realized it was coming from herself. "Oh, gross," she muttered. The sweat from last night was the culprit. With a grimace, she hurried to the bathroom for a much-needed shower. After cleaning up, Melissa dressed and headed downstairs, the mouth-watering smell of breakfast drawing her in like a magnet. She found Scott at the stove, expertly flipping pancakes onto a plate piled high with bacon and eggs. "Good morning, Scott," Melissa said, smiling warmly. "When did you leave my room? I didn't even hear you." Scott turned and grinned at her. "Good morning, Mom. I woke up about an hour ago. You seemed fine, so I didn't want to wake you. How are you feeling?" Melissa's face lit up with excitement. "I feel incredible. If I focus, I can hear the neighbors talking, I can smell everything, and my vision is so sharp it's like I have new eyes. And my body," she flexed her arms playfully. "I feel like I could lift a car. This is amazing." Scott chuckled. "That's just the beginning, Mom. You haven't even fully transformed yet." Melissa tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "In order to truly become a werewolf, you need to experience your first full moon," Scott explained, flipping the last pancake onto the stack. "And lucky for you, tonight's the night." Melissa nodded thoughtfully. "I see. So what happens then?" Scott set the plate on the table and gestured for her to sit. "We'll get to that later. Right now, I want to see if you've inherited my abilities or if you're more like a regular werewolf." Melissa raised an eyebrow. "How do we figure that out?" "It's simple," Scott said with a mischievous grin. "Just try leaving the house." Melissa looked at him, confused. "Leave the house? Why?" "Trust me," Scott said, crossing his arms. "I'll explain after you try." With a shrug, Melissa walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside. Nothing happened. She stood there for a moment, looking around before stepping back inside. Scott's face lit up with excitement. Without warning, he rushed forward and hugged her tightly. "Yes." Melissa blinked in surprise. "Okay, what's going on, Scott? Why are you so excited?" Pulling back, Scott grinned. "Remember what I told you about mountain ash last night?" Melissa nodded slowly. "Yes, it can create a barrier that traps supernatural creatures or keeps them out." "Why?" "I asked Deaton to place a mountain ash barrier around our house," Scott said. Melissa's eyes widened. "And it doesn't work on us?" Scott nodded. "Exactly. Not only that, but we're immune to all typical werewolf weaknesses. No wolfsbane, no losing control, nothing. Plus, we have the ability to take powers from other creatures and make them our own." Melissa stared at him, processing what he'd said. "Wow. That's incredible." Then, as if a thought struck her, her expression darkened. "Wait, Scott. Does that mean anyone you turn will also have these abilities?" Scott nodded again. "Yes. Why?" Melissa stepped closer, her tone serious. "Scott, promise me you won't turn anyone else." Scott frowned. "Why not?" "I'm your mother," Melissa said firmly. "Even with these abilities, I'd never hurt you. But what if you turn someone else, and they become stronger than you by stealing other creatures' powers? What if they hurt you, or worse, kill you?" Realizing her concern, Scott smiled softly. "Have I ever told you how much I love you, Mom?" Melissa softened, but her voice remained firm. "I love you too, but I'm serious. This is dangerous." Scott chuckled. "Mom, remember what I told you about pack dynamics? The stronger the pack, the stronger the alpha becomes. So you don't need to worry. Besides, I'll only turn people I trust completely." Melissa let out a relieved sigh. "So you mean now that I'm your beta, the stronger I get, the stronger you get? And I can never surpass you?" Scott nodded. "Exactly." Melissa smiled. "That's a relief. I just don't want anyone to take advantage of you, my little dork." Scott groaned. "Not cool, Mom." They both laughed, the tension easing. After breakfast, Scott pushed his chair back and stood. "All right, let's figure out who the bastard was that dared to lay his hands on you yesterday." Melissa watched as Scott came up behind her. Before she could ask what he meant, she felt a sharp pain at the back of her neck. Scott had inserted his claws, and a flood of images filled her mind. Together, they relived her memories from the hospital, following her routine until they reached the blood bank. There, the face of her attacker became clear, a man with sharp features, pale skin, and piercing eyes. Scott pulled his claws back, the wounds on Melissa's neck healing instantly. His jaw tightened as he asked, "Who is he, Mom?" Melissa's voice trembled slightly. "His name is Eric Muller. He came to Beacon Hills about a month ago from Germany. He's the new hematologist at the hospital." Scott's lips curled into a smirk. A hematologist? As one would expect from a bloodsucker. "All right, Mom. Call in sick today and stay home. I've got to head to school, but after you go through your first full moon tonight, we'll hunt him down." Melissa nodded. "All right. Go on then. Don't be late." That evening, Scott returned home after a long day at school and his shift at the clinic. Melissa was waiting for him, her nerves evident in her tight smile. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Scott asked, setting his bag down. "Do you feel like you're about to lose control now that the moon's out?" Melissa shook her head. "No, but I feel something deep inside me, like it's waiting to break free." Scott grinned. "That's your inner she-wolf. Let's head to the preserve. You'll need some space, and don't forget to bring a change of clothes." They drove to the Beacon Hills Preserve, finding a secluded area away from prying eyes. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the forest. Scott turned to Melissa, his voice calm but encouraging. "All right, Mom. Let it out. Let your inner she-wolf take over." Melissa hesitated, glancing at her son. His confidence and warmth reassured her. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, ready to embrace the transformation awaiting her.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.